Okay, let's pick back up here, Chapter 7. I get a little excited when we get to this point in the class because for me, I sort of, and I've told Karen this earlier today in the office, I sort of feel like we finally are getting to the material that matters. So much of what we do in the first 6 chapters is, a bunch of information that you need to know for the test, but may not seem all that relevant to the real world. But like I think you could tell earlier when we talked about the contract, how excited I get when we talk about real world things and actually representing clients. And now we get to the meat of the class. This is where we really talk about real estate representation and what it means to work with clients and the ways you can work with clients. I find this information to be much more interesting, which makes it easier to learn, I think, when you're more engaged with it. So hopefully you guys will feel the same way. So real estate brokerage and the law of agency. The business has changed. We're going to talk about sort of the evolution of the business and how it has changed over the years. But there have been some pretty major changes in how we have done the business. For example, 30 years ago, which is not all that long ago, only sellers had representation in real estate transactions. Buyers just simply didn't have the option of being represented. So there have been some pretty major changes to the way the business is done. But one thing that has not changed is the fact that North Carolina is considered a caveat emptor state. Caveat emptor, which is on page 127 in your textbook, translates to let the buyer beware. Now, North Carolina is still a caveat emptor state. So what do you think that means about the responsibility for finding out things and in a transaction? Where does that responsibility fall? On the buyer, right? Here's the catch, though. Caveat emptor predates real estate brokerage. The idea of caveat emptor assumes that the only 2 people involved in the transaction are the buyer and the seller. When real estate brokers get involved, it becomes much muddier. There is no such thing as let the buyer beware when it involves a real estate broker. It's let the broker beware, quite honestly. Because our purpose, if you look at the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, you look up their mission statement, their purpose is to protect the public. From who? Us. That's exactly right. We pay the Real Estate Commission to protect the public from us. So our purpose is to protect our clients. That's what we're licensed for. That's why we're paid, is to protect the best interest of our clients. So we don't get to say things like caveat emptor as real estate brokers. You need to understand the idea of caveat emptor. It still applies when it comes to sellers. And I'll give you an example of what I mean about the conflict there. If there's a leaky roof in a house, a seller in North Carolina is under no obligation to tell the buyer that the roof leaks. Now, they can't lie about it. That's different than just not representing, right? That's different than saying it's on you to find out. But they don't have to tell them. What do you think about a real estate broker involved in that transaction?
They should tell.
We have to tell them. So there's a different set of rules for brokers than there are for sellers. So don't forget that when you think about caveat emptor. That's for the buyer and the seller, not for us. All right? As I said earlier, for most of the first 100 years of real estate representation, everybody represented the seller. It says even when properties were listed in the MLS, so even when the MLS came along, even when firms started cooperating with one another, that's what the MLS is for. The MLS is so real estate firms could cooperate with one another and share listings. Because there was a time when if you wanted to see every property that was for sale in a particular town, you'd have to go to every individual real estate firm because they could only show you or advertise properties that were listed with them. And that was determined to be really unwieldy and not very productive. And so the MLS was born even before computers were in existence, and there were listing books. And all the firms would share their listings, and they would put these books together once a week with all the updated listings. And you could go to any real estate firm now, and you could see everything that was available in that town, not just the things that were available from that firm. So even when that cooperation first started, only sellers had representation in the transaction. However, that became really confusing for buyers. I always tell a little story about this survey that was done. The Federal Trade Commission in the early 1980s conducted a survey where they interviewed 1,000 recent home purchasers. And at that point in time, buyer agency did not exist anywhere in the country, right? But the MLS had come into existence where these firms were cooperating. So a lot of times what would happen is I might walk into a real estate firm and say, I'm interested in this property. And they bring out the listing book and they would show me, well, this property is available and it suits your needs. And then they'd take me and they would show me the property. And in front of the property would be a sign from a different real estate firm, right? But who was that broker that I was with representing? The seller, because only sellers had representation. Even though the listing was with another firm, basically by cooperating, what that other firm was saying was, you can represent our seller too. And if you find us a buyer, we'll share the commission with you. Does that make sense for everybody? That's what the MLS was. It was a way to share commissions, really. And they said, but who were you representing when you brought that buyer to the table? You were representing the seller, because that was all that was allowed. Do you see how as a buyer that might be confusing? When you come in and I sit down with Tracy at ABC Real Estate and she says, well, you know, XYZ Real Estate across town has got this listing that looks pretty good. I think it might work for you. You want me to show it to you? And Tracy takes that buyer and she shows them that property and they want to make an offer. She's like, okay, well, I hope you put together an offer and I'll get it submitted over to ABC Real Estate. What does that buyer start to think after a while?
That you're representing them.
That you're representing them. You're on their team, because clearly there's another firm who's representing the seller. So gosh, if they're on the seller side, this person, Tracy, seems nice enough. She must be on my side. Do you see where that confusion would start to creep in? So in the early 80s, the Federal Trade Commission did a survey, and they surveyed 1,000 recent home buyers, and they asked them a question, and they said, in your purchase, did the real estate firm represent the seller, or did they represent you? Now, keep in mind, at that point in time, 100% of them should have said what?
The seller.
Seller. About 20% in the early 80s said that the real estate firm represented them. They reconducted that same survey in 1990, and it was 67%. 67% of buyers thought that they had representation in the transaction. So let me ask you this question. Is it dangerous to be talking to somebody who's working against you but think that person's working for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Extremely so, right? That's sort of like going into the district attorney's office and spilling your guts in hopes that he can get you off. That's not going to help, right? You know, you don't want to be putting yourself in that position. And so the Federal Trade Commission basically sent out a memo to every real estate commission, real estate board in the country that said, fix it. This is a consumer protection issue, and if you don't fix it, we're going to take away this authority from you, and we're going to license real estate brokers. So if you want to maintain this control, you need to fix it. Well, the fix was to create buyer agencies. So that's how the business has sort of evolved into this creation of a system where both sellers and buyers could have representation in transactions. It was not something that real estate brokers just thought, oh, we should represent buyers as well. It never entered their mindset, really, quite honestly. It was something that the buying public sort of became conscious of and said, that makes no sense whatsoever. And so eventually we got buyer agency into the picture, which brought on the whole idea of now I'm actually working on behalf of the buyer, trying to get the best deal possible for the buyer, rather than everybody working in the seller's best interest. I mean, can you imagine a buyer coming and saying, what should you offer? And you work for the seller. Oh, you got to pay big to get this one. Right? This is crazy. So that's how buyer agency came to be. Now, the law of agency still governs everything we do in representing clients. It's not a specific law. It's not like a North Carolina general statute. You can't pull up a statute number and look at the law. The law of agency is the way we refer to all the laws that govern the way we work with our clients. And it applies not just to real estate brokers, but to anybody who represents somebody else in a legal sense. Who else can you think of that would apply to? What other profession would represent people in a legal sense? Attorneys? Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you hire a professional to stand in your place, to speak for you, to negotiate on your behalf, the law of agency comes into play. And so it's the same set of laws that govern the way attorneys represent their clients. An agent is anybody who is hired to represent or act on behalf of a client or principal. Client and principal mean the same thing. An agent is anybody who is hired to stand in the place of that person, to represent them, to speak for them on their behalf, and sometimes to act on their behalf. That's an agent. All right? And it says, although the law of agency has not changed, the application evolves all the time. We talk about things like who is the licensee. The licensee would be us, right? That's the way the Real Estate Commission refers to you. You are a licensee once you have a real estate license. Who does the licensee represent? By the way, if we're the licensee, who is the licensor? The state, the Real Estate Commission, absolutely. And how will the listing firm cooperate with other firms and agents? Those are the types of things that change often with the law of agency as the business sort of evolves. So we've got some basic terms that you guys need to be familiar with. The first is just that term agency. Agency or agency relationship. And these are on page 128, I believe. Yep, 128 in your textbook. Following along there. It says agency is the relationship that it should be exists, not exits. I need to fix that. My apologies. The relationship that exists when, that's the problem with spell check. If it's actually spelled correctly, it doesn't catch it for you, right? Exits is a word. So, the relationship that exists when one person is authorized to act for another. So an agency relationship is any time someone has been hired to represent someone else. That creates an agency relationship. Now, let's talk about that for a second. In a real estate transaction, who is the client hiring to represent them? The real estate firm. Absolutely. So there's an agency relationship between the real estate firm and the client. Does that make sense for everybody? Because the firm has been hired to stand in the place of that client, that principal. Now, has the firm hired somebody to stand in the firm's place, to act on the firm's behalf and work in the firm's best interest? Who? The brokers or agents within the firm, right? So, would it be fair to say that the brokers within the firm have an agency relationship with the firm? Yeah, they do. And do you think that that flows back up to the client somehow? So do we have an agency relationship with the client? It's actually a special kind of agency relationship called a sub-agency relationship. And we talk about that in just a second. Because sub-agency just means I'm the agent of the agent. Well, who is the agent of the client? The firm. I'm the agent of the firm. So I'm the agent of the agent means I'm a sub-agent. If I'm on the seller's side, I'm a sub-agent of the seller. If I'm on the buyer's side, I'm a sub-agent of the buyer. Pretty simple, right? Okay? So, the principal is the person for whom the agent acts and to whom we owe certain legal duties. Same thing as client. Principal and client mean the same thing. Now, they do not mean the same thing as customer. Anybody want to take a guess at who a customer is?
That'd be the other side of your client.
That'd be the opposite of a client. That's exactly right. A customer is anybody that we do not represent in a transaction.
Third party, right?
Any third party. That's another way of saying a third party. A third party is somebody we don't represent. And we only have one client in any given transaction, but we have lots of customers. Because if I'm the listing agent, so I'm representing the seller, right? Who's my client? The seller. Who are my customers in that transaction?
Buyer.
Buyer.
Yeah, right.
Who else?
The bank.
The bank, the lender, closing attorney, other real estate brokers who are bringing me offers. All of those are my customers in that transaction because a customer is literally anybody that I don't represent. Okay? Whereas a client, I have one client, many customers in the transaction. Okay? And just like the agency is the relationship, when somebody is authorized, the agent is the one who acts on behalf of another. Okay? And then here I put an important note. You might want to highlight that. In North Carolina, this is the firm. In North Carolina, we are set up such that brokers do not represent clients. Brokers represent what? The firm, and the firm represents the clients. That's the way that agency flows in North Carolina. Okay? A sub-agent is just the agent of the agent, as we talked about. And then this last one is fiduciary, which is one of my favorite words. I put it right up there with a pertinent. Fiduciary is a special word because it means you have a trust-based relationship. It means you have been hired by your client and trusted with looking out for their best interest. That is what the word fiduciary means. It means you have that trust. They have hired you to look out for their best interest at all times. Okay? You have a fiduciary relationship with your client, but you do not have a fiduciary relationship with customers or third parties. Okay? All right? And then, as I said, customers, anyone other than. Okay?
So when an agent hires you to find them a house, you're looking out for their best interest?
When a client?
Yes. Sorry, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But if they end up wanting to see a property that you also have listed, that's when you have to have full disclosure, right?
Well, we're going to talk about that. That would be called potentially dual agency, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later, so just hold on to that one.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. It's a good question. Okay? All right. So, as agency goes, because real estate is not the only type of agency relationship, remember we said attorneys have agency relationships. In fact, you don't even have to be an attorney to have an agency relationship. Some of you might have at some point had a power of attorney for somebody. How many of you have ever had that? Or, had a written power of attorney where you could sign a contract on somebody's behalf? That's an agency relationship in and of itself. So these main categories do not apply just to real estate. These are all the categories of the way you can represent somebody else, either as a real estate broker, as an attorney, or as just a normal citizen who's been given power of attorney, for example. A universal agent. You will never be a universal agent in the capacity as a real estate broker. You will not. It's not going to happen. Because a universal agent is an unlimited power of attorney. That means you can do anything on behalf of that client. Sell anything that they own. Buy anything in their name. Spend their money. Steal their money. Whatever you want to do, it's just like it's yours. That's universal agency, universal power of attorney. You're not going to have that as a real estate broker. Is it legally possible for you to? Yes, of course. It's not going to happen in a transaction sense. That's too much authority for us as real estate brokers. Now, general agency, you might do as a real estate broker. And I stress might. General agency still has a lot of power. Here's the key to general agency, and I want to make sure you understand and grasp this. A general agent has the power to bind their client to a contract. A general agent can sign a contract, and it's just like the client signed that contract. In real estate, this pretty much only happens in property management. What kinds of contracts would a property manager sign that would be binding on their client, the property owner, for example? A lease. If a tenant comes in and we execute a lease and I, as the property manager, sign on the landlord's line, I'm signing as the landlord, even though it's not my property. Does that make sense for everybody? And I've been given that authority as the property manager. So a property management agreement would grant this sort of general agency. And the key difference between general agency and the next one we're going to talk about is that ability to sign on behalf of somebody. Now, it's not universal agency, because in universal agency, I'm unlimited. If I want to go buy a boat, I buy a boat. If I want to sell a house, I sell a house. If I want to go invest in stocks, I invest in stocks. Whatever I want to do, I can do it, right? Whereas with general agency, I have pretty unlimited authority, but only for that one specific property or thing, right? And so I can do anything relating to this property. That's the general agency agreement. Most of the time as a real estate broker, you're going to be a special agent. Special agents have almost no authority. We have no authority as a special agent to act on behalf of our client. What do we do as a special agent, you think? I'm sorry? We do. He said what we're told to do. Yeah, that sounds like a smart answer to me. Yeah, we do what we're told to do. We convey information. We speak on their behalf, right? But only when authorized by them. We can't commit them to anything. We don't have the power to accept a contract on one of our clients. The business would be much easier. Trust me, it'd be much easier to list a house if I could accept a contract on their behalf. I would love it, but it doesn't work that way. I don't have that authority because I'm only a special agent. So most of the time as a sales agent, you're going to have a special agency relationship. Everybody good on these three? Good. All right. So again, this is an example of how things flow in North Carolina. You have the client, then the real estate firm as the agent, and then the brokers who are affiliated with that firm are the sub-agents. So I'm going to commonly come back to this sort of setup, so I may as well give it to you the first time. When we talk about agency relationships and how things work, I sort of like to pretend we're all in the same firm in this room, and this is like a sales meeting, okay? So if we all work for the same firm, if we all work for United Real Estate, for example, and let's say Isaiah takes a new listing, okay? Isaiah takes a new listing. How many of us represent that client? How many of us have a fiduciary relationship to that client? All of us, right? Because look at how the relationship flows. Isaiah is down here, right? Can he take a listing? Can Isaiah take a listing? Who is it that really took the listing? The firm. Isaiah took it on behalf of the firm, right? Well, if the firm sits right here, everybody down here on this level represents that client. Does that make sense for everybody? So I know we don't think of it in those terms. I know real estate brokers are very territorial, and we've sort of been conditioned to be that way sometimes, I think. We have my listings, my clients, but that's legally not how it works. In North Carolina, legally, every broker who's affiliated with that firm has a representation responsibility for that client. And that's why when we start talking about things like dual agency, it's a really important thing to understand that just because one broker represents, that means we all do, the entire firm. Same thing is true of a buyer. If Dustin takes on a buyer client, the same thing is true. We all represent that buyer equally. We're all just as legally responsible for that buyer as Dustin is. Okay? Good on that? All right. So how do we create agency relationships in North Carolina? Well, listing contract is the classic way to create an agency relationship in real estate. You can't represent buyers unless there are listings out there, right? This is not a chicken or the egg thing. Listings come first. There's no question. So the listing contract is the #1 way to create an agency relationship. Who would we be creating an agency relationship between in a listing contract? Between what two parties? Seller and real estate firm, absolutely. A buyer agency agreement would create an agency relationship between a buyer and a real estate firm. Something called a dual agency contract, which we'll talk about in just a second, would also create an agency relationship. Property management agreement creates an agency relationship between a firm and a landlord. This is an interesting one. Your in-house brokerage employment contract. Who would have that contract?
Between the sub-agent and the actual firm.
That's exactly right. So the brokers, right? If we all work for United Real Estate, your employment contract with United Real Estate is an agency agreement because you're actually being hired to represent the best interest of your firm, right? So your employment contract is an example of an agency agreement. And then this last one, which is bad. We don't want that to happen. By conduct of the parties. This is also called implied agency. Very bad. The state of North Carolina protects people as much as possible. And what the state basically says is if you have the license to do something, like real estate, and you act as if you have the authority to represent somebody to the public, you now do represent that person. Whether you want to or not, whether they want you to or not. Your actions have implied it, so therefore it is. Here's what I mean by that. If I submit an offer, let's say Jim has a listing, and I bring him an offer from Karen on the property. If we work in two different firms, what's Jim's natural assumption about my relationship with Karen?
You're representing her.
That I represent her, right? If I'm bringing him an offer from a buyer and he's never heard of either one of us, he has a reasonable belief that I represent that buyer. If I don't, the state says now I do. Whether I want to, whether she wants me to. Now, could she sue me because she didn't want me to represent her and now she's stuck with me? Absolutely. You see why implied agency is a bad thing? You don't want to do that. You don't want to act like you have the authority if you don't have it. It also happens a lot in property management. Routinely, we have this problem in property management where, for example, brokers sometimes will place something in the MLS just to help a landlord find a tenant. They don't practice property management. I'm not a property manager. We hear them say that all the time. But I'll help you find a tenant. You can just pay me a finder's fee for helping me find a tenant. Well, that's fine. So they put a sign in the front yard. They put the thing on the MLS. How does the tenant find the property? Through the internet, right? Whose phone number do they see? The real estate brokers. Who do they call? The real estate broker. Who shows them the property? The real estate broker. All right, so they move in. On day one, they got no hot water. Whose phone number do they still have?
Yours.
The real estate brokers. They pick up the phone and they call a real estate broker, and the real estate broker says, look, I have no idea what's going on, but I got to run by there and pick up my sign anyway. I'll take a look at it and see what I can figure out. You know what they just became? The property manager. Because what message have they sent to that tenant?
But you can call you.
That you call me with your problems, right? What should they have said to that tenant?
You need to call.
Call the landlord. I don't handle repairs. I'm not the property man. You see the difference there? That's called implied authority. You acted as if you had that authority, so congratulations, you just got it. And you're probably working for free. Which is lovely, always. Okay? So you don't want to be an implied agency. Okay? And that's just a little breakdown of that. Express agreements can be either oral or written, whereas implied agreements are based on our actions. So an express agreement can be either oral or written. Okay? Compensation. It says firms and brokers owe their loyalty to the client who's employing them, no matter if they're being compensated by another party. So in short, where the money comes from doesn't matter. Most of the time in a sales transaction, who's paying our commission, whether we're on the buyer side or the seller side? The seller is. Even if I'm a buyer representative, so the seller's technically paying me to work against them, right? It's the way it works. It doesn't matter. Our compensation doesn't dictate our representation, is the way they used to always say it when I got my license. Okay? How do we terminate agency relationships? Well, pretty much the exact opposite of how we create them. We create them with a written agreement. We terminate them by either some agreement in writing to terminate, or the better way to terminate an agency relationship is to complete what we were hired for. So if I have a listing agreement, what's the best way to terminate a listing agreement? Sell the house. Best way to terminate a buyer agency agreement is to sell them a house. Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, you can always have a mutual agreement. That's important, though. Mutual agreement. I hear people say things like this all the time. I don't like my real estate firm. I'm going to fire them. No, you're not. They may agree to mutually dissolve that relationship, but it is a contract. The definition of a contract is there are two parties who have both promised to be bound by it. Does that make sense for everybody? There's no hiring and firing here. This is a mutual agreement that needs to happen. Okay?
Expiration would be like when you sign a contract saying, I'll use you for 3 or 6 months while I'm trying to find a house.
Yes, absolutely. And every agency agreement must have a guaranteed expiration date. We're not allowed to have what we call open-ended agency agreements. So our listing agreements, our buyer agency agreements all have to have expiration dates. Okay? Agency relationships, the different types that we can have, there's really 4 different categories of ways that we can work with clients, particularly in sales transactions. Exclusive seller agency, exclusive buyer agency. When firms cooperate, so one firm representing the buyer and one firm representing the seller, and then dual agency. And we're going to talk about in detail what each one of these looks like and what each one is. And they're started on page 133. So, again, how do things flow? Same chart we looked at before, but just a reminder. The client, then the firm, and then the sub-agents or brokers who work for the firm. It's always flowing in that direction. Okay? Single seller agency or single seller sub-agency. You might say the same thing. It means the same thing. You might say it either way. In that case, the firm only represents the seller. The only representation we have here is seller representation. The buyer is unrepresented in the transaction. Nobody's working on the buyer side. This is the way real estate was done for 100 years before buyer agency came into existence. The big thing here is to be careful to make sure the buyer knows that they're unrepresented. And so that's why I've put on here, it's the oldest form of real estate brokerage, but you must be careful in how you deal with them so that they don't make a mistake of thinking you represent them in the transaction. Really simple to understand, not very common. Most real estate firms in North Carolina now represent both buyers and sellers. So it's very unusual to find a firm that only represents sellers or only represents buyers. And this is what a kind of a flow chart of a transaction, if you will, might look like. You've got the agent and the seller who are on a team together, so to speak. But then the buyer is over here unrepresented. They're by themselves. Okay? The agent or firm represents the seller, but the buyer is unrepresented. Now, in single agency buyer representation, it's pretty much the exact opposite of the seller situation. And this is even a smaller number. There are almost no firms who only represent buyers, who never represent sellers. The good thing about being in one of these single agency firms is things are very uncomplicated, right? You don't have to worry about, am I on the buyer side, am I on the seller side, is it dual agency? Because you're in a firm that only represents one side or the other of the transaction. Problem is, you won't find very many firms who operate in that way. And very, very few operate as this model where you only have buyer representation. And so our chart looks exactly opposite as it did before. In this case, it's the seller that's unrepresented, and the firm represents the buyer. Now, I will give you a notable exception to when this might be in effect. The firm might not be a single agency firm, but can you think of an opportunity or a time when the seller might be unrepresented in the transaction, but the buyer has representation? FSBO, or for sale by owner, exactly right. Sometimes they fancy things up too much. They call it an unrepresented seller transaction. It's just single buyer agency. That's what it means. There's only one firm involved in the transaction, and they're working for the buyer. Okay? Now, co-brokered transactions are ones that are the most common in North Carolina. These are by far the most common transactions in North Carolina. Co-brokered transactions mean that both parties have representation, and they're from two separate firms. The buyer has representation, the seller has representation. Now, I've introduced you to some new terminology on this screen. You've heard me several times say the listing firm. Who does the listing firm represent? The seller. Now I'm going to give you some of the most confusing terminology in the entire class. What does it say there for the agent or firm representing the buyer?
Selling firm.
The selling firm. There's one you need to memorize, right? There's no helping you with that one. You just got to memorize it. The listing firm represents who? The seller. And the selling firm represents the buyer in the transaction. Yeah, Jim's over there shaking his head. Yeah, I get it. Trust me. I say the same thing all the time. Whoever came up with that. But that is the way it works. The selling firm represents the buyer, the listing firm represents the seller, and this is the most common setup for a real estate transaction in North Carolina. It's called a co-brokered transaction. And so to give you an idea of how a co-brokered transaction really works, the mechanics of it, who's agreed to pay a commission?
The seller.
The seller has. So who have they agreed to pay a commission to?
To the listing firm.
To the listing firm, right? And they've also authorized the listing firm to do what with that commission?
To split it.
To split it or share it with this firm up here who brings a buyer to the transaction. So if you wanted to look at the way the commission would flow, it would go from here to here and then up to here. Does that make sense to everybody? We don't have direct payment of commission from seller to the selling firm. It actually, the commission is owed to the listing firm, and then the listing firm has agreed to split that commission with a cooperating selling firm.
Quick question.
Yeah.
If you have a license,
I do, by the way.
if anybody, and they represent themselves as a buyer, is that?
Yes, absolutely. So your question is, can I represent myself as a buyer if I have a real estate license?
Well, do you get the commission
And the
You can
answer,
save the commission, basically.
the answer to that, so his question is, if I'm licensed, can I represent myself as a buyer in a transaction, and can I be paid the commission on the transaction? The answer to that question is a vehement yes, you can, okay? Legally, you can be paid the commission. Here's a better question. How about if you're not licensed? Can you represent yourself as a buyer and be paid a commission?
You can't be paid commission.
Oh, you can't?
You can if you're listing only yourself.
Oh, right.
Remember what I said that definition of brokerage was on the first night? It buy, sell, lease, list, exchange, auction, real property, and what was the last 4 words? For others, for compensation. So, now I'll give you the question again. Can I, as an unlicensed person, represent myself in a transaction and be paid the commission? Yes. Legally, absolutely, no question. You want to know the practical answer? The practical answer is very different. The practical answer is no. And here's why. Most people have to get a little thing called a loan to buy a property, right? And if you represent yourself in a transaction and you're unlicensed, who's the commission going to be paid to?
If you're the buyer, then it would be the selling agent that's gonna get paid the commission.
But who's it going to be shown as paid to on the closing statement? The selling agent is me, right? If I'm representing myself, the selling agent is me. How's my lender going to feel about looking at that closing statement and seeing the buyer getting paid a commission to buy a house? What do you think a lender's going to say about that? No. That's what they're going to say. No. No, you can't. So, is there a law that prevents you from doing that? Absolutely not. It's going to be your lender that prevents you from doing it. Now, if you're licensed, who's the commission going to be paid to on the closing statement? Who represents the client?
The firm.
The firm. Does the lender know who's working on behalf of the firm?
No.
No. So, now the practical answer to your question is there a difference between being licensed and unlicensed and being able to represent yourself and being paid a commission?
Yes.
You better believe it. Because if you're licensed, you hang your license with a firm, that commission's paid to the firm, and the lender has no control over that. They can't say no because it's not being paid directly to you. They have no knowledge of where it's being paid because it's being paid to United Real Estate. Does that make sense? Whereas if I come in and I represent myself, my name on there, they're going to say no. Now, that's a lending distinction, not a legal one. Legally, technically, you never need a license to represent yourself. Make sense? I know that was probably a longer answer than you bargained for, but I wanted to give you the legal answer and the practical answer. There. Okay? So, buyer agency, I've got a little note in here for you about buyer agency before we go any further, and it has to do with this idea of an express agreement being either oral or in writing. Remember I said we could have express agency agreements that are either oral or in writing. Well, that's true and not true. We can only have one type of agency agreement that can be oral, and that's buyer agency. Buyer agency is the only real estate agency relationship that can exist in an oral fashion, meaning you don't have to have a written buyer agency agreement in order to legally represent that buyer. Everybody follow me that so far? That does not mean you never have to have a written buyer agency agreement, because the rules are pretty specific. I can represent a buyer client orally up to a certain point. That point being when I want to get paid. And to get paid, we have to go under contract, right? So before I can present an offer on behalf of that buyer, what do you think I have to do with that oral buyer agency agreement? Put it in writing. Put it in writing. So we can have oral buyer agency up to the time we present an offer on a property. And as soon as we present an offer, before we present an offer, we have to have that buyer agency agreement reduced to writing. Okay? So I wanted to insert that in there. Now, some things you need to know about oral buyer agency, and you'll definitely be tested on them. So I would make sure you know the information on this slide. Unlike listings, which must always be in writing, you can never list a property for sale without a written listing agreement. You can never have a property management agreement unless it's in writing. The only agency agreement you can have that's oral is a buyer agency agreement. That's first. Second, it says oral buyer agency is non-exclusive. And what I've put in parentheses there, not binding. Not binding on who? The buyer. Why would you have, what's the benefit to the real estate firm of having a buyer agency agreement? Why do we have them?
So that you're the only person that's representing that client.
So we're the only ones who can legally represent that client, right? So we're guaranteed to get what? To get paid. That's the benefit. Does that make sense for everybody? The benefit of having a buyer agency agreement in writing is we want to bind them to our firm and make sure that if and when they do buy something, we get paid. That's the importance of having a written buyer agency agreement. So one of the main rules about an oral buyer agency agreement is it's non-exclusive or non-binding. Can they go work with another firm tomorrow if we have an oral agreement? Absolutely. Absolutely they can.
And can they, like if you say we showed somebody 15 Main Street, and they decide they just don't like you, and so they go to Joe Schmo's real estate and say, I want to see 15 Main Street.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll go even one further than that. I have to tell you a story. You see all kinds of things when you're on my side of the classroom here. Years ago, I had an agent in class, and she was, I won't say older, but she was middle-aged lady, retired school teacher, and she needed to take all the post-licensing classes to activate her license, because she had had her license for like 4 years, but she had never taken any of the post-licensing classes, so she was taking all 3 of them back to back to back, so she'd get her license back active, right? And the reason she was doing that was that she was going to represent her sister in a transaction. Her sister was buying a house in Raleigh. She had this real estate license. She had never used it, but she wanted to represent her sister in the transaction. Okay, it's understandable. Well, about 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from an agent friend of mine in the business, and Michelle said, I just need somebody to vent to. And I said, okay, sure. And so she starts explaining to me how she's worked with this client for like 3 months, and she's shown her 400 houses. Those were her words. I don't know how many she actually showed her, but I'm assuming it was somewhat less than 400, but a lot is I guess, a good number there. She showed her all these houses, took her around all these places, finally found a house she loved. And then they were going to put an offer together, and the lady stopped answering her phone. Wouldn't call her back. Couldn't get in touch with her, wasn't responding to her emails. Now keep in mind, she's been looking at all these houses, been responsive the whole time. Now they found a house she loves, and she didn't hear back from her. About 2 weeks later, she finally gets in touch with this lady, and the lady says, yeah, you know, I decided to go in a different direction. My sister has her real estate license, and she's representing me in the transaction. Anybody want to guess who the sister was? The lady I had in the post-licensing classes. So does that tell you about the dangers of continuing to work with somebody with an oral buyer agency agreement? They'll use and abuse you folks. I promise they will. Now, just as an aside, and this is, I'm not telling you how you have to do your business, I'm going to tell you how you should do it. Everybody has their own rules for how they'll do that. For me, I will go out with any buyer the first time without a buyer agency agreement, because I feel like they need an opportunity to get to know me, I need an opportunity to get to know them, we need to get a feel for if that's going to be a good relationship moving forward, because I may not want to work with them, they may not want to work with me, all those things. But if we spend an entire day out looking at houses, and then they call me back 3 days later and they want to set up next Saturday to go out and spend a whole nother day looking at houses, it's time for a buyer agency agreement. Because one of 2 things has happened there. They've either decided that my services are worthwhile for them to engage, right? Or they need to decide that my services are worthwhile to engage. So you get 1 free day from me, and after that, I want a buyer agency agreement. And the way I explain it to them is, listen, it's in your best interest too, because I can't really act on your behalf until we have this in place, and I'm not obligated to keep your personal and confidential information personal and confidential until you hire me. So, the time has come, and sometimes they're concerned about, one of the things I find that agents screw up when they're doing buyer agency agreements. They make the thing for like 6 months. Well, of course somebody's scared to sign it. You know, like they feel like they're signing away their life. I'll give you a little hint. It's a lot easier to get it extended than it is to get it signed. Say something like, let's just do it for this week. That way if we find a house today, we're covered and we're ready to make an offer. Nobody is scared by a week, right? You know, you get them to sign, they're hiring you for a week. Well, at the end of the week, all you got to do is send them an email that says, hey, you know, our buyer agency agreement is expiring. Are you okay with extending it? Sure. Great. We just extended our agency agreement. See how easy that is? Versus putting something in front of them, 180 days. Hiring you for 6 months. Hold on, man. What, are we going to move in together or something? You know? You see what I'm saying? You got to learn the psychology of dealing with people too. The more you push, the harder they push back. And that's a big part of our business. Okay? So is everybody good with oral buyer agency and understand the basic dynamics of it? Okay? Good. Now, again, the most common firm example in North Carolina is firms that practice both buyer agency and seller agency. Now let me ask you a question. If a firm represents both buyers and sellers, is there some potential for something to happen that we haven't talked about so far? What is that something?
Conflict of interest.
A conflict of interest. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you know all the dirty details about the buyer and the seller, then you have to pick loyalty to someone.
So what you're saying is it's possible that one of our buyer clients might become interested in one of our listings. If our firm represents both buyers and sellers, there's always the possibility that one of our buyers could become interested in one of our listings, right?
Right.
And if they do, that is an inherent conflict of interest, right? I would think so. We've got a conflict of interest where we've been hired to represent the best interest of the buyer. Well, give me off the top of your head, what's one of the best interests of the buyer? We should always be trying to get what?
The lowest price.
Lowest price, okay. We've also been hired to represent the best interest of the
Seller.
seller. Well, give me off the top of your head, what's one of the best interests of the seller? Kind of a tough balancing act, right? It's tough to do both of those jobs at the same time. The short answer is you can't do both of those jobs at the same time, and that is called dual agency. Okay? That is called dual agency. When the real estate firm has come into a position of representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time, it's called dual agency, and we're going to talk a lot about that in just a couple minutes. Okay? So dual agency is the practice of the firm representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction. It is a conflict of interest. It dramatically increases your likelihood of screwing up, of getting in trouble, because the rules become so much more sticky when you're trying to balance one client against another. It's pretty straightforward when I only represent the buyer that I'm doing everything I can possibly do to help the buyer. The same thing is true when I only represent the seller. But now that I represent both, there's a lot of gray area about, well, should I say that? Or no, if I say that, that hurts the other one. So there's a lot of potential for conflict there, and that brings up the potential for you getting in trouble. Okay? You should only create dual agency intentionally and when it is clearly disclosed to both parties. Okay? It should not be accidental. Oops, I forgot to tell you. No. It doesn't work that way. You get their permission before you show them the property. Well in advance. Okay? It says when a firm agrees to act as the agent of both the buyer and both the seller and prospective buyer in a real estate transaction, we call that a dual agency transaction. It should be disclosed. Disclosed dual agency is what we want to have if we're going to have dual agency at all. Disclosed dual agency is intentionally created. It's for in-house transactions. You need the informed and written consent. Both of those are equally important. Informed consent, and it needs to be in what? Writing. Of which party? Both parties. And the disclosure part is to reduce the risk to the firm and to both the clients. Now I'm going to give you something that the book doesn't say a lot about, but I'm going to talk to you in a real world sense about dual agency and my personal beliefs, and I think it'll serve you well if you'd like to keep your real estate license once you get it. Dual agency is legal in North Carolina. That does not mean dual agency is a preferred vehicle in North Carolina. Now, there are plenty of agents who love dual agency.
Yeah.
Now, why do they like dual
Because they
agency?
get all the
Commission.
commission
They
on the
get
split of it.
all the commission, right? So, is it fair to say that they're more motivated by money than they are by the best interest of their clients? Yes, don't do that. That's pretty simple and straightforward. Don't let that be the motivation for dual agency. Dual agency is legal because sometimes, folks, it's unavoidable. Let me explain what I mean by that. If I list a property for sale, and for a minute I'm just going to forget the idea of a firm being a dual agent. I'm just going to talk to you about one broker because I think it's easier to grasp the concept, and then we'll expand it to a whole firm, okay? So let's assume I'm a one-person firm. If I take a listing, like I just talked to the assistant baseball coach, he's moving, I'm going to take his listing. Somebody calls me off of this, calls me up and says, look, I see you just got this new listing, I want to see it. Great. Who do I represent in that case? The seller. How about though if that person who calls me up is a buyer that I've been working with for 6 weeks and already have a written buyer agency agreement with? What if I've been showing them property for 6 weeks, and remember I only give you one free day and then we sign a buyer agency agreement. So I have a written buyer agency agreement to represent the buyer. I have a written listing agreement to represent the seller. We're in dual agency. Does that make sense? The only way I can show that property to that buyer is if they authorize dual agency. Otherwise, I have to say to them, I can't show it to you. Why not? Because it's my listing. I don't care. Well, you said you did because you didn't authorize me to act as a dual agent. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so for you to look at this property, that means I no longer am working for you in the transaction. I'm actually just passing information along between the two of you. If you're okay with that and you want to authorize that, that's all right. Who else would need to authorize it? The seller would. Does that make sense? Now, the reason it's legal is because that situation is going to arise from time to time. What you have to get really good about is explaining to the clients the pluses and minuses. So, too many agents only like to talk to their clients about pluses, and that's why they get sued down the road. They don't want to tell them anything negative. Well, you can't very well go to court and say, I warned them, if you never warned them, right? So what are some things that you think you might need to be warning a client about in dual agency?
That you understand, like, if the seller is in distress, that you know that he's in distress.
Maybe I know it. Maybe I can, maybe I know things that I can't share with you.
Yeah, you can't disclose everything.
I can't disclose everything because if I say something about one, does it hurt the other?
Right.
Right? See, I'm not allowed to hurt either one of my clients, right? What's the biggest piece of advice I might give a buyer in a transaction?
What they should be willing to pay for.
What they should offer. You think I can advise them on offer price if I represent both sides? No, because if I'm giving them good advice, I'm hurting the seller. If I give the seller good advice on price, I'm hurting the buyer. So some of the warnings that should be is, if you authorize this, you're really going to sacrifice a lot of my representation. You're going to be on your own for a lot of this, right? What are some of the pluses to them? In fact, I can only think of one.
You want to have someone buy a house and you want to sell your property at the same time. So you're...
Give me the plus for the buyer.
They want that house.
That's it. That's the only one. Did you hear what he said? They want that house. And the only way they can legally make an offer on that house is if they authorize me to act as a dual agent because they've already hired me. And the seller's already hired me. It's not possible for us to all pretend like that didn't already happen. Does that make sense? So the benefit to them at that point is to say, how much do you want to look at this house? Because if you don't want to authorize this dual agency thing, we got to go find another house. Does that make sense for everybody? But they need to understand what they're giving up. That's important. It's important.
Could the buyer terminate the buyer agreement?
Not unilaterally.
You both have
Not
to
Two
agree.
of you together?
Could we agree? Yes, but here's what you'd have to also agree to, and what the buyer would have to also agree to. Do I likely know some things that might harm the buyer in that transaction? like maybe what they're willing to pay for a house, why they need to buy, what their motivations for purchasing are, you see what? And if I no longer represent the buyer and I only represent the seller, what do I have to do with all that information?
Just give it straight to the seller.
Straight to the seller. So the buyer who did that would have to be warned again about the dangers of, if they want to be released and I'm agreeing to release them, that's fine, but understand when you go,
I can tell the
your
person.
right to confidentiality is gone with you, and now I'm only working on one side. So if you thought I was real good, do you really want to be working against me in the transaction? That might be worse than just not having me really work for you. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
There's no good outcome once you're already in the muck. That doesn't mean you have to purposefully put yourself in the muck. A lot of agents, when they get that phone call, think, oh good, I can do dual agency, right? When I get that phone call, if it's not a buyer that I already represent, I am not interested in representing that buyer. Because here's the thing, folks. What did I say the motivation for most agents was in doing dual agency? The commission without splitting it, right? We haven't looked at the buyer agency agreement yet or the listing agreement yet, but we talked a bit about how that commission flows. Commission is paid to which firm first?
Seller.
The seller's firm, the listing firm, right? And the agreement says if there is a cooperating firm representing the buyer, aka a selling firm, then we agree to split the commission. What was that first word? If. So a buyer calls me and they want to look at one of my listings. A lot of agents go and they want to put them in a dual agency because they think I can get both sides. Here's a better solution. Don't make it into two sides. Make it one side. How can I make it only be one side? Say to the buyer, I represent the seller. I'm happy to show you the property. I'm happy to help you put together an offer. As long as you remember, I represent the seller. If the buyer really wants to look at the property, are they going to care?
No.
No. In fact, they probably don't even want to go find a buyer's agent at that point in time. They just want to look at the property. If the buyer makes an offer unrepresented, who am I splitting the commission with?
Nobody.
Yourself.
Nobody. Myself, exactly. Me, myself, and I. It's a three-way split, right? And what liability did I take on as far as being a dual agent?
None.
None. What conflict of interest do I have?
None.
You see how that's a better way, potentially? And by the way, that's not some new concept. That's the way real estate was practiced for 1,000 years, right? Everybody represented the seller. It's still possible to do it that way. Okay? So I just want you to kind of think out. That's not in the book, but that's just a real world approach to some of these dual agency ideas. Okay? We're prohibited for acting for more than one party without the full knowledge of all the parties. I think that's pretty clear. You've got to get the permission of both parties in order to do this thing. We've got to have their informed and written consent. It's got to be in writing. Right? How do we service two clients with conflicting interests? As we just said, we don't. We don't. We talk to them about the things that they have to sacrifice. Normally we're supposed to disclose everything to our client that would be beneficial to them when we work as an exclusive agent. When we're only on one side, we disclose everything. We tell them everything that would help them. We don't do that when we're working as a dual agent. Okay? So how do we solve that dilemma? We give ourselves a contract that limits what we do. It's called a dual agency agreement. It's actually part of the listing agreement, part of the buyer agency agreement. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead right now and I'm going to draft a couple of you. Karen, will you help me for a second?
Sure.
Okay, so last night we left off on page 138. We had just finished talking about dual agency and specifically designated dual agency. And we want to now pick up, since we've talked about the different forms of agency relationships that are in North Carolina, we want to talk about disclosing that to our client. How do we explain those agency relationships to our clients? I gave you last night, one of the things that we passed out was a copy of the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. So as we go into this section, I'd like you to kind of have that handy. You do have it in your textbook. If you flip over, yeah, exactly. If you flip over to page 141, it's copied in your textbook, but I find that to be a little bit difficult to read, so I've given you a full-size printed version of the form. So in North Carolina, we have a law, and you don't need to know the statute number, 58A0104. You don't need to know that, okay? But that is the statute or law in North Carolina. Sometimes we talk about real estate commission rules, and sometimes we talk about statutes. Statutes are heavier than real estate commission rules. This is a statute that says every real estate broker who's engaged in a real estate transaction has to disclose to anybody that they come in contact with and go as far as having substantial contact, and we'll talk about exactly what substantial contact is. But basically, when we engage people in real estate transactions, we have a duty to tell them who it is that we represent in that transaction. Sometimes that means we're warning them, hey, I'm working against you. Sometimes that means we're telling them, hey, I'd like to work for you. But we have to tell them where we stand in that transaction. So we do that using the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. The Working with Real Estate Agents brochure comes from the Real Estate Commission. It's not like the sales contract and the listing agreement, because those things come from where? Where does that sales contract that we go over come from? The Association of Realtors, right? This document comes directly from the Real Estate Commission. This is one of the few documents that the Real Estate Commission themselves generate. And it says that we should disclose our agency status at first substantial contact. And then it also says that we should use this in what kind of transactions? Sales transactions. I'm going to repeat that because I'm guessing at some point in your future that distinction is going to become important. Hint, hint, nod, nod. You use this in sales transactions. That's not all transactions. Tell me what transactions would not be included in sales transactions. Leases. Absolutely. This document, and if you look at it, if you just look at the document, working with real estate agents, the first section is titled what?
Buying or selling? Sellers.
Sellers. The second section is titled what?
Buyers.
Buyers. I'm just looking, where do you see tenants on here? Or landlords? It's not there. So if you see some question, hint, hint, about this document somewhere, and that question asks you what kind of transactions you utilize this document in, what would be your answer to that?
Sales.
Sales. Anytime you're selling real estate, this is an appropriate form. How about selling land? Selling a house? Selling a condo? Yes, selling anything, but not leasing anything. Okay? So we want to talk about, I turned my clicker on here. There we go. We want to talk about the document, and by the way, this is what the pamphlet version looks like. You don't have to utilize the pamphlet version, and I generally don't utilize the pamphlet version because I have to pay for that. They don't give it to you for free, you have to buy it. And they're like $0.25 a piece, and I don't want to pay the real estate commission $0.25 a piece. It's really not the money, I just don't want to have to go and order them and get them shipped in here. And so what I generally use is this version, which is fine. The real estate commission doesn't care what format you utilize this document as long as you don't change the verbiage. You know, as long as you use the verbiage. As a matter of fact, you can even have your own brochure with your own logo on it, your own firm's logo on it, as long as it's got the same verbiage and information. You're free to utilize the verbiage any way you want to, as long as you don't change the verbiage in any way. But this is what the pamphlet version looks like, and it does have a little tear-off signature panel, which makes it kind of nice, but you can use this version as well. So let's talk about first substantial contact. Why did we say first substantial contact was important? If you look back at the previous slide, 2 slides ago, it says what happens at first substantial contact?
It's an oral agreement.
Well,
You get sensitive information.
okay, you get sensitive information, but why is it important for our discussion here? What does it trigger?
A
Relationship.
fiduciary like process.
No, it doesn't trigger a fiduciary relationship.
An agency.
It, it triggers us having to tell these people what our agency status is. See, we need a trigger. Otherwise, we'd be just running around to everybody we meet going, hey, by the way, I'm a real estate agent, and I might represent you in a transaction. I really don't know. We would be crazy, right? So we need a trigger. We need something that tells us, okay, now's the time to disclose to this person that we are a real estate broker and we're working on this transaction, and we are working for them, we're working against them, whatever our status is. And that time, that trigger is first substantial contact. So first substantial contact happens in a number of ways. It can happen in person, obviously, and I'll talk about what it exactly is in just a second. But it can also happen, particularly in today's world, through telephone or through email, through electronic communications. Because here is the definition of first substantial contact, and I hate that phrase, even though I say it 50,000 times, because it's too fancy for me. I don't know what I would really rename it, but to me it doesn't convey what it really is. First substantial contact, and I'll give you my golden rule of real estate, happens when you stop talking about property and you start talking about people. Remember last night when we talked about designated dual agency and Tracy asked the question about, well, what if I go in the office and I tell everybody in the office about my clients? And I said, well, you would probably poison the pool for dual agents or designated dual agency. Y'all remember that last night when we talked about it? What did I say? You could have conversations about what?
The property.
Property, but not
People.
the people. So that's sort of my golden rule of real estate. When you stop talking about property and you start talking about people, you've crossed a line. And sometimes you're allowed to cross that line, sometimes you're not allowed to cross that line, but something always changes whenever you shift gears from talking about property to talking about people. So first substantial contact is when that shift happens in the conversation. When you start a conversation with somebody, a real estate conversation, it almost always starts property, right? Somebody comes up to you with a question about a property. Somebody comes up to you with a question about listing their property. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I saw this house on the internet, what can you tell me about it? These conversations almost always start with property. The crazy thing is, though, they almost always navigate away from property and into
What you're looking for.
what I'm looking for, why I'm looking, when I need to buy, what my price point is, when I'm looking to sell my house, why I'm selling my house, something about the people involved. And the Real Estate Commission says that's personal and confidential information because it could change the dynamic of the real estate transaction. So as soon as they give you anything personal about themselves, you know, yeah, we're looking to buy within the next 6 months because my job is being relocated there. Right then. That's first substantial contact. We're not talking about property anymore, are we? We're talking about them. And that's first substantial contact, and that is what the Real Estate Commission says is your trigger. That's the latest possible time where you can tell them, hold on just a minute, before we go any further in this conversation, we need to talk about some things.
It's so crazy. I just, it was literally 3 weeks ago, because, I was going to have to move, and found a property that I happened to like. And so I just reached out to the listing people, and then they referred me to somebody. It was 1 a.m., and someone reached back to me super early that morning. And you're right, everything you're saying, when you go back and think about how it played out, it's just like this. It's so crazy.
Well, that's good. That means hopefully they did it the right way. We'll find out as we work through
I know,
this,
right?
So here's what the Real Estate Commission says. The Real Estate Commission says you should treat this conversation like this. Once you've had first substantial contact, this should be what the interaction looks like. How many of you are familiar with the Miranda rights? Right?
Mm-hmm.
What do they say? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can or will be used against you where? In a real estate transaction. That's the way the Real Estate Commission wants you to view presenting this document. Because really what this document is for the consumer is a warning. It's, hey, you're dealing with somebody who knows more about this stuff than you do. And you don't yet know if they're on your side. As a matter of fact, when we're having this conversation, they should know for sure that you're not on their side. Because here's the thing, folks. It's absolutely impossible to represent somebody without already having had first substantial contact and having had this discussion. Do you understand that this discussion comes way before they actually hire you? Does that make sense? It should if you're doing it right. And so you're giving them a warning to say, wait, before you start telling me everything about yourself, you should know that I don't represent you yet. So maybe you want to hold on to that information. When would that be super important to tell a potential buyer? I'll help you along. I'm dealing with a buyer. They call me on a listing. And they ask me a bunch of questions about the listing. And they say, well, when is it available? I said, well, it's available anytime the property's vacant. Great, because my job starts next week and we really need to find something quickly because I've been looking and can't find anything else. Well, let me stop you right there and let you know that I represent the seller. Why do I need to do that?
You've gotten information that would be useful to the seller.
Why would that information be useful to the seller?
Because he knows he's got someone who needs a house, and so he can hold out for her money.
Gotta have it. Can't find it, right? They've already told us, they've given the game away, right? They've already told us information that they probably should not have. So I have to stop that flow of information. Now, just like our friend here, once you've given the warning, if they want to continue to give the information, that's on them, right? Just because they have the right to remain silent doesn't mean they have the ability to. Trust me. They're two different things. But you have to give them the warning. You have to say, I represent the seller. You shouldn't tell me anything that you don't want the seller to know. See what I mean about a warning? It's a warning for them. Now, we're going to talk about lots of different situations and scenarios that can come up because it's not going to be always I represent the seller. That conversation can go in a number of different ways based on the situation, but that's the most simple one to give you as an example with first substantial contact. Does everybody understand the idea of first substantial contact? Okay? So give me some examples. All right, we just had one. First substantial contact with a buyer happens when they start to tell us why they need to buy or what their timeline for buying is. How about first substantial contact with a seller?
It could be the same way. It could be trying to tell you that I need to sell, I want you to sell my house, I need to sell it in such amount of time because of such and such.
Yeah. Or what else information could they give you potentially that they might have a conversation with you about?
Like something wrong or problems.
Problems with the property.
The house is going in foreclosure.
The house is going in foreclosure, so I got to do something quickly. I need $50,000 for my down payment on my next house. So I have to sell this house for at least this amount of money. You understand, all those things could easily come into a conversation with a seller. As a matter of fact, I'm going to tell you a little story right here. I'm going to relay a story to you about presenting this thing, because a lot of brokers, for better or worse, and we're getting better at it. It's only taken us 20 years that this thing's been around. We're getting better though. A lot of brokers who've been licensed for a long time view this as like a chain around their neck. They hate it because they hate the idea of having to put some formal looking piece of paper in front of somebody as soon as we start the conversation. Because this is kind of right at the beginning of the conversation, right? I mean, it's not, we haven't been showing these people houses for 3 weeks. This is right at the beginning. Because how can you show somebody houses until they tell you what?
What you want to know.
What they want. What they're looking for. You can't. And so the truth is, with a buyer, first substantial contact has always happened if you've shown them property. Because what if they just fall out of the sky and say, that one, right? No. They gave you information, so you found that one for them. So you've had first substantial contact. With a seller, it's the same way. You go sit down with a seller and talk about selling their house. That's first substantial contact because they've already, just the act of telling you, I want to sell my house, is me. That's information about me, right? That is first substantial contact. So I'll share a story with you about how you should approach this mentally, and it'll help you, I think, when you get out in the real world. This really happened to me years ago. And I had just started teaching for the Real Estate Commission. And of course, I was all gung-ho about doing everything the right way. You know, I teach now. I got to have that reputation as the guy who does it right all the time. And so I went to a listing presentation, and it was late at night. It was probably 8:30. And they'd made the appointment at that time. And I showed up and I rang the doorbell, and listing presentation, you know, it's a big deal. You want to be prepared for it. You want to be ready to go. And I had been practicing for a few years at that point in time. But it was a nice listing, and I really wanted it. And I had really prepped. I'd done my little presentation book, glossy stuff, done a CMA for them. I was ready to go. And the husband comes to the door, and I said it was 8:30. He looked like it was 1:30 in the morning. That's how tired he looked when he answered the doorbell. And he invited me in, and we came in and we sat down at the dining room table. His wife was already sitting there, and she looked worse than he did. It's like, are these people hitting the liquor a little bit early tonight? I mean, what's wrong with these? I mean, they look rough. They look worn out. Well, I realized pretty quickly why they were worn out. I looked, and they had a stack this tall of listing presentations sitting on the table. They had been interviewing listing firms all day long. I was the 8th of the, can you imagine sitting there through 8 listing presentations in a row? That's just miserable for me to think about, and I'm in real estate, right? So I immediately abandoned my book because I wasn't going to add to that pile, you know. and I just started talking to them, and as soon as I started talking to them, just, I mean, not even about their house, just, you know, well, hey, are y'all having a good day? The husband interrupts me, and he's already shut down, right? You know, he's got the walls built up, and the first thing he says is, listen, I don't mean to be rude, but it's late, I'm tired. All I want to know is how much you charge. Now, me being who I am, I can't just let you go with that, right? You know, so I looked at him dead in the eye, 100% serious, and said, I usually try to charge about 100%, but we can negotiate if you'd like. And it took him about that long before he finally cracked a smile, like, well, I guess you probably do. I'm like, yeah, I had to do something to get your attention. So, you know, let's talk about selling your house. But see, you know, you kind of have to break the ice sometimes with people. That's not the point of the story, trust me. I didn't go all that way just to get that joke in there. But I did say that to him to break the ice. I pulled out the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. I said, before we get started, guys, I'm sure you've already seen this thing a bunch of times today, but I'm required to give it to you. And I caught this look between the husband and wife when I said, I'm sure you've seen this thing a bunch of times. Now keep in mind, this is 10 years ago. But I kept going. I said, like I'm sure all the other agents explained to you, I don't represent you yet. And in the end of the day, you can only hire one real estate firm to represent you in this transaction. So please do me a favor and you a favor, and don't tell me a bunch of information about what you'd be willing to take for the house, how fast you need to sell the house, why you need to sell the house, until you've decided 100% for sure that you do want to hire me. Because let me let you in on why that's important. If you're interviewing 8 of us, and you tell all 8 of us what you'd be willing to accept, and then you can only hire one of us, that's 7 brokers that are running around with the information, right? There's a pretty good chance that one of those 7 may end up representing a buyer who's interested in purchasing your property. And if they do end up representing a buyer who's interested in purchasing that property, everything you told them, or everything you tell me during this little consultation,
It's free game.
not only is it fair game, I have to disclose it.
Yeah.
I don't have a choice. Even if I don't want to, even if I feel dirty about doing that to you, I don't have a choice, because at that point I have a contractual obligation, a fiduciary. I didn't say fiduciary, I'm using that for your benefit. But I have a contractual obligation to tell them. So please do me a favor and just hold off on giving me any personal confidential information until after you decide you want to hire me.
Let me guess, you're the first person that said that today.
The wife looked at the husband and goes, first of all, I don't remember seeing this thing at all today. And she said, second of all, nobody else has certainly ever explained it in that way. And third of all, and she's looking right at her husband at this point in time, if the other ones won't tell us that, what else are they not telling us? Who do you think got the listing?
You.
You. And you know what? They never asked again how much I charged either. Funny thing, right? That was the only thing they cared about at the beginning, of that presentation, but after 5 minutes of talking about the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, they didn't even care to ask what I charged because they were so convinced that I was actually there to look out for their best interest. Does that make sense? And if you present this thing in the right light, your clients will be appreciative of it, not view it as... Now, can it put you off on a bad foot? Absolutely, but that's all in how you present it. That's not them. That's you. You have to get comfortable with the presentation of the thing first, and then they will be comfortable with it. I don't ever have a problem with we're going to talk about getting people to sign it as we work through it. I never have a problem getting people to sign it because I present it in a way that's not, it's just not, they don't feel like they're being backed into a corner. They have to, you know, the first thing I tell my agents is, I say, do you have a hard time getting the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure signed? I said, and they go, oh God, yeah. I mean, I just met them and here I'm trying to get them to sign something. They're scared to death. They're signing away their life. And I show them, you flip over to the last page there. What does it say on that signature page right at the top? This is not a contract, right? In bold letters. Well, they start showing, look, it's not a contract, it's not a contract. Now, if I just met you and you start showing me a piece of paper asking me to sign it, and I'm showing you how much it's not a contract, what do you think it is? A contract. We're cynical by nature. We're protective by nature. You know what I say to people about the signature panel? Because I'll ask my agents this. I say, how do you ask for the signature? I said, well, I go over there and I explain to them it's not a contract. I said, you already messed up. Because it was a loaded trick question. What did I ask them? How did you
Ask them to sign.
ask them to sign it? That's the first mistake. You don't.
Yeah, my guy didn't.
You don't. You simply point out to them that there's a signature page. They'll figure out that they're supposed to sign it. And they'll say, well, do I have to sign this? I say, absolutely not. It's not a big deal. If you want to sign it, that's great. You're just signing saying that I presented the thing to you. If you don't want to sign it, if you're not comfortable signing it, I'm just going to write on there refuse to sign it. I'm going to turn it in anyway. Don't care. Not a big deal. You know what they do? They sign it.
I asked him to sign it. I said, I'll just sign it.
See?
He cut, yeah.
If you don't make it a pushy big deal where people feel cornered, they'll sign it. Of course I want them to sign it, really. But the best way to get them to sign it is to tell them, I don't care if you do or don't. See what I mean? So it's all in, I'm sorry?
I said reverse psychology.
It is. It is. It's not, and it's just understanding people. And this is a people-based business, right? Now, that's not what you'll find in the law about this thing. Of course, the law does say you don't have to get it signed. It's fine if they don't sign it. It is truly fine if they don't sign it. But the more you push, the harder they push back. Okay? So, as we go through this thing, don't get tensed up about it, thinking, oh, God, I got to do all this. Think about it in a way that you can present it that's comfortable for people. Okay? So, once they've given that personal confidential information, what do we call that point in time? First substantial contact. That's when we have to stop the flow of information. That's the you have the right to remain silent moment. It's that, hey, before you tell me any more, I need to let you know something. Okay? Now, the brochure itself is not a contract, as we have mentioned and as we have showed you. It does not create an agency relationship at all. It's mandatory that you review the brochure with them, but it's not mandatory that they sign it. It's mandatory for you to give it to them, go over it with them. It's not mandatory for them to sign it. It is good to request that they sign it so that you can have proof you presented it. But if they don't worry about it. You are going to keep the signature panel whether they sign it or not. That signature page you're going to keep in your records whether they sign it or not. And what are you going to do? Just like I told you. If they don't sign it, what are you going to do?
Right, refuse to sign.
You're right, refuse to sign, and then you sign it. Because at least you have something in your record showing that you presented the thing. The important point is presenting the document and going over it with them. The review is the most important thing. What if they don't sign? Well, they don't have to. Simple as that. Okay? So, we need to talk about the different ways you can present this document. And I talked about already having that conversation with a seller. So, disclosure of agency status by a seller's agent to a prospective buyer. remember, what did we say last night that we called the broker who represents the seller? The sub-agent of the seller. Y'all remember that terminology? Because the agent is the firm, right? So the brokers within the firm are called sub-agent of the seller. We also use that phrase to specifically address the situation where the buyer doesn't have representation, where the buyer is dealing with a real estate broker. They're working with a real estate broker, but they're not being represented by that real estate broker. The broker is actually representing the seller in the transaction. And the classic example of that is like an on-site sales representative, right? And they are new home communities. Those are almost always sub-agents of the seller. They work with buyers all day long. They help buyers make choices about granite countertops and what color the siding is going to be and whether they're going to upgrade the carpet in the pad and yada, yada, yada. But who do they actually represent? The seller, the builder, right? Same person. The seller is the builder. So they are a sub-agent of the seller. And so the way you give the warning to a buyer when you're a sub-agent of the seller is to say, I represent the seller. Please don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know. Does that make sense? Yeah?
They don't do that.
So they don't do that. Here's an interesting thing, and we're going to talk about this to some extent later on in this chapter. When you say they don't do that, I assume you're talking about those on-site sales agents, right? Okay? So interestingly enough, most of those on-site sales agents don't have a real estate license. And it's not required that they have a real estate license. Because one of the exemptions that's available in North Carolina is if you're the salaried employee
We learned about that.
and we talked about it in license law rules, right? If you're the salaried employee of the owner of the property, then you don't need a real estate license to sell that property for that owner, to manage that property for that owner. As long as you're salaried, which means you paid with what? A W-2, not a 1099. And so most of the time, when you encounter those on-site sales agents, they're not licensed. And this is the specific reason why, right here. Because what would you do if I put you in this situation? If you come in and I say, hey, how you doing? You know, let me show you around. I'd be glad to show you our models. Let me know if you have any questions. And you come back and you got lots of questions and you're talking about financing programs and telling them about what you want to buy and where you want to buy. And they don't say anything about who they represent. And you go through and you write a contract and they help you make all these choices and they help you do all these things. Man, they are awesome. If I ask you after you walk out of there who that guy in there represents, what are you probably going to say? Me, right? You think the builders like that dynamic? Are you more likely to spend more money if you feel like the person who's across the table from you is on your side?
Oh yeah, it'll help you upgrade.
Absolutely. They'll help you upgrade, right? They're so helpful, aren't they? Now, change that dynamic up a little bit. If you go in there and you tell that person, hey, I'm thinking about buying because my job's being transferred here, and they go, well, let me tell you first of all that I represent the seller, so you shouldn't tell me anything the seller wants to know. Aren't you more likely to go, well, do I need somebody to represent me? Are you more likely to have a buyer's agent represent you if the person across the table is warning you that they represent the seller? I think most of the time you are, which is exactly why most builders don't want somebody who is licensed on the other side of that table, because if they are licensed, they have to give this warning. Make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't know all of that until, like, I don't know, something just clicked when we bought our house. And I didn't have an agent, but I negotiated my own contract with, you know, with the it was in my homes and the representative, and she said none of that about representing the seller.
Right.
And I got what I asked for on the contract, and I didn't know I could do it. I just did it. I just didn't go for the ask what they were asking for on the home. And, you know, I just didn't do it.
Did it on your own.
I did it on my own.
You represented yourself.
I want refrigerator,
Right.
I want washer and dryer, and they did it.
Yep. Good. Good. Good for you. You know, a lot of people, though, when they walk into those places,
They think that
they feel like they don't need representation, because here's the problem. A lot of buyers view buyer representation as somebody to open a house for. They don't understand all that goes into being a good buyer representative. Some of that is the public not knowing. A lot of that is a lot of agents who really don't do anything other than open doors. Those are the real problems, right? The real problems are the buyer's agents who don't really advocate for their clients. Because I can assure you that my buyer clients, when the transaction's over, will say, I ain't ever doing that without him. Because I really work for them. And we make sure they're completely taken care of from beginning to end. That's part of the deal. You have to do that as well. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell because like we went, my sister and they're still looking, and it was like 2 weeks ago, maybe last week, I can't keep up. We went to look at some, and their realtor for them went with us in one of those homes, like you're saying, and the lady's there, and our realtor's talking with their representative, and other people are coming in because it's kind of like an open house format, and they're asking, and then they see my sister with her buyer, and they ask, well, why does she have someone with her?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it was interesting, because like you don't think about those things, and then as you're reading this with you, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, like.
Yes, yeah, I mean, there's a real value to having a buyer representative, because the things that you negotiated on your behalf, a lot of people just don't think about. If they don't see a refrigerator there, they never think to ask, and they certainly aren't going to volunteer. Oh, we're going to include a refrigerator if you want one. No, they're not going to say that. I'm not going to say that. But if you say, look, I want a refrigerator as part of it. I have never in my career sold a new construction house that didn't include window treatments and a refrigerator at bare minimum.
Absolutely.
Window treatments is the one that everybody forgets. Everybody.
Yes.
Until the day you move in.
Yeah.
And then you come out of the bathroom
It's
and you're
just
standing there and the whole neighborhood staring at you wide open. Right? Those big windows in that master bedroom look great before you moved in, and then you get in there and you got no blinds on the windows and it ain't so great anymore. And that's expensive, folks. I mean, you can spend $3,000 on blinds in a heartbeat, right? And then you got to put them up or deal with putting them up. So, yeah, those are the kinds of things that you do need buyer representation in new construction. Absolutely.
It just goes back to what we were talking about the other night when you were saying about commission. But the bank wouldn't have done it anyway if they had saw my name. I just wish I could have got my commission.
Right, that's right. That's exactly right. Secu would not have liked to see your name on that line.
Exactly.
But trust me, as somebody who has bought several houses with Secu loans, I got paid a commission on every single one of them because it wasn't my name on the line. It was my firm's name on the line. But that check went to my firm and then right to me. And it's nice to get paid to buy a house, I remember when I bought my first house, I thought, man, this is the racket right here. I did a 100% loan. The seller paid my closing costs. And then I got paid a commission on top of that. I'm like, let's go buy another one. I can get rich just buying houses. I don't have to sell any, right? It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. But eventually you run out of credit. Eventually, at some point. So, all right. So, how do you present the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure if you are dealing with a seller or a seller's agent and you represent the buyer? Well, you probably don't have to present the actual brochure, but you do need to inform them. You need to let them know. So if you represent the buyer and you have contact with the seller or the seller's agent, you need to be very clear about the fact that you represent a buyer. Again, so they won't give you that personal confidential information. Okay? We're going to talk about disclosing dual agency. So what I'd like to do with you real quick is kind of give you a little bit of a role play situation, right? Because I find that going through how to present this brochure is better served as a role play, right? Do I have somebody who doesn't mind coming up here and role? Okay, come on, Tracy. Somehow I didn't think she minded.
I joke he married me so he wouldn't have to talk anymore.
There you go. That's a good pair, right? Okay. So if you don't mind, you be a buyer who's come to an open house, and I'll be the broker who's holding the open house. All right. So I'm going to give you a couple of different scenarios here of how things play out, or could play out at an open house. Because an open house is sort of the opportunity where you don't know who you're dealing with. I could be dealing with a buyer who's interested in this property. I could be dealing with a buyer who's interested in other properties. I could be dealing with a dual agency situation. I could be dealing with a seller client. Well, it could be somebody else down the street who's thinking about selling their house, who comes to my open house just to see what I'm doing to market the property, right? So I kind of have to be prepared for all the possibilities when I'm at an open house, when I'm holding that house open. So Tracy, welcome to my open house. It's good to see you. How are you?
I'm dandy, thanks for asking.
Good. Take a look around, make yourself at home, and let me know if you have any questions, all right? So have we had first substantial contact?
No.
No. Absolutely. I don't need to disclose anything to her at that point in time. Even if I had given her my name and she'd given me her name, it was not first substantial contact. So she wanders off and she looks at the house and she comes back, and I catch her on the way back and I said, well, what'd you think of the property?
It's very nice. A little too big for me though.
Okay, right there. Number one, why did I ask her what she thought of the property?
So you can engage her.
To engage her, right? I'm there to hopefully sell this property, but the truth is, in an open house, you very rarely sell the property that you're holding open, right? So I'm not really searching for her to buy this house. I'm trying to engage her in a conversation because I do want to see if I might have some relationship with her down the road, right?
Absolutely.
But I need to know what kind of relationship that might be. If she's interested in this house, what two routes could my conversation take? Remember, if I'm holding the open house, who do I represent already? The seller, right? So now I have a buyer, and she said she wasn't, but let's just pretend for a second that she was, okay? She likes this house. It's a nice house. I might be interested in it. What two ways could that conversation go?
You can tell her that you represent the buyer. I mean, like, you have to start that into the
Represent the
seller.
seller.
Seller, sorry.
Right?
Yeah.
I should tell her I represent the seller, but what two, think back to last night and those different forms of agency, okay? Dual agency is a possibility, right? She said dual agency. Is dual agency a possibility here? Absolutely. Dual agency is very much a possibility because I don't know yet if she has a buyer agent representative, and if she doesn't, I could move forward with her as a dual agent in that transaction. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
What other one did I mention to you that's an alternative to dual agency? That's still dual agency. Remember, there was one I said that's completely an alternative to dual agency.
Oh, you can.
When you yourself represent both, not
That's
the buyer.
dual
Well, you're the
agency.
seller
Oh,
agent,
wait.
but I would know that you are the seller's agent and I don't care.
Right, seller sub-agency, right? That's still an option.
Sub-agency.
Seller sub-agency, where I just say to her what? Let me let you know, I represent the seller. And she understands that. She doesn't have representation. Could she go forward in the transaction without representation?
Yes.
Sure. Whose side am I going to stay on? The seller's side. She's not going to have a representative. Or dual agency. Those are the two possibilities if she's interested in this house. Does that make sense? She wasn't interested in the house, though. So let me ask you this question. Do I need to explain dual agency to somebody who tells me they're not interested in dual agency right now?
No.
Did she have to say she wasn't interested in dual agency right now? No, because she told me what?
She wasn't interested in the house.
She's not interested in the property. The only way dual agency is a concern is if she's interested in that particular property. Does that make sense for you guys? You're not going to spend 15 minutes explaining stuff that's not relevant to her situation. Right? And in this case, I'm not even going to bother giving her the warning that I represent the seller. Why not? What does she tell me?
She's not interested.
She's not interested in this property. So she doesn't have to worry about giving me personal confidential information that can harm me with this seller. Does that make sense for you? But she did tell me it was what?
Too big.
Too big.
Too big for
Her.
her. So then what does that mean still?
Is it?
She's still looking.
That's first substantial contact. Right? She's given me information about herself. Does everybody follow that? So even though I don't need to talk to her about dual agency and I don't need to talk to her about seller sub-agency because she's not interested in the property, is it time for the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure? Yes, absolutely. It's time for the brochure.
Because you could say, oh, I have some smaller houses that you might be interested in.
That's exactly right, because I'm not just going to tell her, well, get the hell out of here. I'm not,
You're proud enough, the living room lady.
that is not the way this works, right? I'm like that old lady on the commercial. That's not how any of this works, right? I want to convert her into a client of some type, right? That's the whole purpose of being here at this open house. It's not really to sell that particular house that we would love to. It's to be able to generate business and clients, right? So it's time for me to present the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure because she's giving me that personal information. You didn't realize you're going to be up here all night, right? You know?
I'm good.
So I'll have them somewhere in the house and say, well, let me let you know first of all, obviously this is my listing and it's okay that you're not interested in it because most people that come in aren't going to be interested in that specific house. Are you working with an agent currently?
I am not.
Why do I need to ask her that question?
Because if she is, she's already with somebody.
If she's working with somebody, is that pretty much the end of the discussion?
Yeah.
Yes. Discussion over. Because I can't continue with her in any fashion, right? She's not interested in this property. She's not interested in hiring me as a buyer's agent because she already has one. So, we're done. But she said, what? No.
She's not.
She's not. So am I interested in continuing the conversation?
Absolutely.
Yes. Good. Well, if you give me an idea, maybe, of what you were looking for, I'd be happy to try to see if there's some other things that might be available for you, if you'd like, if that sounds like something you'd be interested in.
Certainly.
How's that sound? Okay. So what I'll do then is maybe just have you jot down some of your criteria, what you're really looking for, and then I can set you up on a search and maybe send you some things. If you don't like them, you don't ever have to respond back to them. If you do see something that's of interest to you, shoot me back an email and we can set up a time for you to go look at it. How's that sound?
That sounds lovely.
How hard was that?
No.
How hard was that? Now, here's why, at the end, I need to get her to make some sort of a decision. Does she want me to send her these listings? What have I created the basic foundation for?
Agreement?
What kind of an agreement?
Oral.
A buyer agency. Oral
Sorry.
buyer agency. You're exactly right, right? Basically, she's told me she wants to engage my services as an oral buyer representative. Now, people say, oh my God, she didn't say that. Sure she did, because she told me she wanted me to do what?
Send you listings.
Send her some listings. What do you think a buyer's agent does?
Send listings.
Send listings. Try to get her engaged until she wants to look at something. Is there any danger to her in that? No, because oral buyer agency is what?
Non-binding.
Non-binding, right?
And non-exclusive.
Non-exclusive. I haven't bound her to a thing. Does that make sense for everybody, how you would, approach that? Do me a favor real quick. Let's go back to that question about are you interested in this house. I want to show you how the conversation might be different, right? What'd you think of the house, Tracy?
It's lovely.
So, was there something in particular you liked about it?
The living room is just the size I'm looking for.
Okay, good. Well, first of all, let me let you know that I represent the seller, right? I'm sure you noticed the sign outside. The state says I have to let you know that. Shouldn't tell me anything you don't want the seller to know. Why did I do that right there?
Because she gave you an indication that she possibly might like that particular
And
house
she said it's just the
Right.
size
for her.
I'm looking for.
Yeah, anything farther, you're getting deeper into
That's
the
exactly right. I'm
deep.
deeper in the mud. I've gone as far as I need to go without giving that warning, right? Did I give it to her in an uncomfortable way?
No.
Something that's going to make her freak out and run for the hill? No, I don't think so, at least, right? Because she's probably like, oh yeah, I saw your sign outside. I knew who you were, right? That's what she's thinking in the back of her mind, but I've given her the warning. I said, well, it's good. It's a lovely house. We've had a lot of interest. We don't have any offers yet. Are you working with an agent who's helping you find something?
Am I or am I not?
You tell me. No, that's
Okay. No, actually I'm not.
no. She's not working with an agent. Okay. So again, what are my choices now? She likes the house. She's not working with an agent.
Seller sub-agency.
Seller sub-agency or dual agency. If I wanted to present seller sub-agency to her, I've already done it, right? What am I going to do? I'm just going to reiterate. Well, it's okay. You don't have to have representation in the transaction if you don't want to. Just remember that I represent the seller. Now, I know you're interested. You have some interest. If I can help you put together an offer, I'd be glad to do that. Just know that I can't give you advice because obviously I'm working on the other side of the transaction. Have I done everything I need to do to warn her about not telling me? Yeah. Can I work with her as a seller sub-agent? Yeah. But if I was going to pursue dual agency with her, either form of dual agency, true dual agency or possibly designated dual agency, I would need to explain that to her, right? So this is what that explanation might look like. Look, if you don't have an agent, I highly recommend you have somebody represent you in the transaction. Now, our firm can represent you, if you're thinking about making an offer on the property, and either I could work with you and the seller at the same time. I wouldn't be able to give you any advice because obviously I can't give you advice and not give it to them, or I could have somebody else in my firm take over and help you in the transaction, and they would be able to give you advice. Didn't I just explain the two forms of dual agency to her? The first was true dual agency, the second was designated dual agency. And then again, I need her to make a decision. She's going to tell me, well, yeah, you know, I really don't want to have representation, or
I have bought 100 houses. I can do this.
and I've heard that very response before when I've told people, you know, well, I represent the seller. Cool.
That's fine.
I'm great with that. In fact, I'm doing a little.
Yeah.
That's the best answer, right? If she says I bought 100 houses, folks, I'm telling you, thank you, Tracy. I appreciate it. So I mean, I had a listing. She did good, right? You know,
Yeah.
I had a listing in Chapel Hill a couple of years ago, and this story is real. The head baseball coach at UNC was selling his house, and we put the house on the market. As a matter of fact, I didn't have the house on the market yet. We listed it, and I went over there on a Thursday afternoon and put the sign up, and we were going to make it active the following morning because he was leaving town for the College World Series and going to be gone for 2 weeks. So it was the perfect time to put the house on the market because nobody's home, could show it, not going to interfere with anything. So I got home from putting the sign up, and I had a phone call. And it was from a gentleman who was a physician at Duke Hospital, and he introduced himself. He said, I'm interested in the house you have in Edgewater. And I said, well, it'll be active tomorrow and available for showings, so if you want to get in touch with your agent, I'm sure they'll be able to show it to you tomorrow. And he said, well, actually, I don't have an agent. I'd just like to see the house. And I said, well, let me explain something to you. I represent the seller, and I don't practice what's called dual agency, so I'd be happy to show you the house, but if you want to have somebody represent you in the transaction, I would need to either give somebody a call and have them show you the house, or you'd have to represent yourself. And he's like, I've bought 8 houses before. That's what he said, exactly, verbatim. Bought 8 houses before. I don't need somebody to represent me. We missed the last house in this neighborhood, and we think this might be the house for us, and we want to make sure that we see it. And I said, okay, I'll come show it to you. And I did. I drove over there, and I opened the house up. Before we went in, I gave working with real estate agents right on the front porch, and I said, look, just remember, I represent the seller. Please don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know. They looked at the house for 10 minutes. They said, I think we want to make an offer. I said, all right, here's what we do. I'm going to get the contract, and we're going to go over the contract, and I'm going to explain it to you. And I explained due diligence to them, and the due diligence fee, and the due diligence process, and earnest money deposits, and when it was refundable, when it was not refundable. Is that giving them advice, or is that just facilitating the transaction? Facilitating. So I said to them, here are the numbers I need from you. I'm going to need a due diligence fee. Remember, that's that non-refundable amount of money for the seller to take the property off the market. I'm going to need an earnest money deposit. That's the refundable amount that you would get back if you terminated during the due diligence period. I need a closing date, right? I need to know if you're going to ask the seller to pay any of your closing costs. I'm going to go outside and sit by the pool so y'all can discuss it and come up with numbers, and you don't have to worry about me overhearing anything. Just let me know when you're ready. The house is listed at $650,000, okay, with 6% commission. Now, I'm already excited at the proposition that we might get an offer from somebody that does not have a buyer representative in that situation. So I go outside and I sit by the pool for about 15 minutes, and they come and they get me, and I go back in. I say, okay, what do you want to offer as far as a purchase price goes? Oh, $650. Full price. Okay, I'm right. What do you want to offer as a due diligence fee? $10,000. I'm writing. What do you want to offer as an earnest money deposit? $30,000. I'm writing. What am I thinking the whole time?
Yummy, yummy.
I know the happy dance in my head.
Happy day, right?
I'm waiting for the catch.
And there ain't no catch. Now, I didn't want to just like smile ear to ear like some fool right in front of them, but you can best believe I was thinking it, right?
Really loudly.
Yes, absolutely. And so it absolutely works that way. You just have to know where the boundaries are. And with this Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, you're only presenting what applies to them and their situation. If dual agency is not on the table, don't explain it. Will there be ample time to come back and explain it if you need to later on down the road? Of course. And here's the thing, folks. The explanation is going to mean so much more to them if you're explaining it when it actually becomes an issue. A lot of times with buyers, I don't get my buyers to authorize dual agency up front because I don't want to explain it to them. Because 90% of the time, it's never an issue. They're not looking at something listed by my firm. They're looking at things listed by other firms. And so I'm spending 20 minutes explaining this nightmare situation to them, and the nightmare situation hasn't even come up yet. Does that make sense? If it does, and if they do want to look at something listed by my firm, can I have the dual agency conversation then and get them to go back and authorize dual agency after that? Sure. Sure. All right? Is everybody good on what you're explaining here with the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure? Okay? Third part is try to get the signature, of course. We want them to sign it if we can. If they don't, that's fine too. You want to keep the signature panel, and you're going to keep it for 3 years in your record. That's the Real Estate Commission rule for records retention. All records must be kept for 3 years from the end of the transaction. So it's from whenever the transaction ends, you keep your records for 3 years. And these signature panels are included in those records. If it's an auction sale, and I'm not going to spend very much time on this at all, other than to say, yes, real estate can be auctioned in the state of North Carolina. If it is, you need 2 licenses. You need an auctioneer's license and a real estate broker's license. If you're going to auction real estate in North Carolina, you need both licenses. That's all you need to know about it. Okay. Okay. Turn in your book to page 145.
Come on, bring it there.
And we want to start talking about our duties, our legal obligations to our clients. I will tell you that the book uses a little bit different mnemonic than I do on the next slide, but it's the same thing. First of all, as we talked about last night, our client is our fiduciary. We have a fiduciary relationship with our client, and that just means it's a trust-based relationship. We've been hired and been entrusted with representing the best interest of our client. Okay? That's not the relationship we have with customers. Remember that. Customers or third parties, we don't have a fiduciary relationship or responsibility with. Right? The duties that we owe our clients, they give you old car in the book. I've always used loads. It works the same, whichever one you want to utilize. Loads, loyalty, accounting, loyalty, obedience, accounting, disclosure, and skill, care, and diligence is the one that I was always taught. So it's the one I use. They give you old car in the book. Same exact ideas here in play. You don't need to be able to quote them for a test question, but you might need to be able to recognize which of the following is not a duty owed to principals in North Carolina, for example. So let's talk about each one of these. It says, when we talk about loyalty and obedience, and those two go together, it says the client or principal expects us to comply with all their lawful instructions. We comply with their instructions as long as what they're saying is legal. We're going to talk about, in particular, some things later on when we talk about material facts and disclosure that might be illegal commands that we get from our client. Let me just give you an example. Don't tell anybody the roof leaks. That's not a legal command. We're required by law to disclose those sorts of things. So we don't follow all of our clients' commands. We only follow the ones that we legally can follow. And sometimes you just have to tell them, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to do that. All right? Our duty is to represent our client's best interest, not our own best interest. Don't ever forget that, please. Sometimes I think some brokers do. And we are expected to exercise fidelity toward our client, which means we're expected to stay true to them. Self-dealing. There are a couple different types of self-dealing that we need to talk about. Self-dealing basically means when you're personally involved in the transaction in some way. We call that self-dealing. Anytime you have a relationship with somebody who's a principal in the transaction, you need to disclose that to everybody involved in the transaction. If this is your mom's house that you're listing, you need to tell the potential buyer that this is your mom's house you're listing. If you have any kind of relationship with either of the parties in the transaction, make sure you disclose that, particularly because it might influence the client's decision making. So, for example, if you bring an offer on a listing of yours and the buyer is your first cousin, do you think the seller has a right to know that? Because you're advising that seller on that offer, right? And the seller needs to know that your advice might be sort of colored by who the buyer is on the other side of the transaction. We hope it's not, but they need to know that because it might influence the decision that they make. And we are absolutely forbidden from making a secret profit on any transaction being handled for the principal. What that basically means is that they have to know every dollar we're paid. We can't be paid money without our client knowing it. They have to be clearly disclosed any money we're paid. So if we're paid a bonus, for example, by a builder, do we have to tell the buyer?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay? We can't represent any interest adverse to our client, so any interest that's against our client without their knowledge and consent. So especially things like dual agency would fall into that category. And we must keep all their personal information personal and confidential. Don't disclose things about your own client. Accounting. Accounting has to do with money, handling our client's money. We do that in a trust account. Okay? Now, we're going to talk a lot about trust accounts as we go through those license law rules in the back. You know, we started on the license law and rule. I say in the back, I gave you a handout. It's also in the back of your book. That handout, the license law and rule comments, we're going to talk a lot about the details of trust accounts. So here, this is just a basic overview of our responsibilities as brokers in handling other people's money. One of the first terms that you come across is something called commingling. Has anybody read ahead enough to know what commingling means? Yep.
It's where you're taking that, like money that should be in a trust and you're putting it in an account where everyday business expenses are. So you're commingling.
You're mixing,
funds,
right?
Mixing
money that should be in trust is mixed with money that should not be in trust, right. Or vice versa, right?
Right.
And here's the thing, folks, commingling works two ways. Most people think of commingling as having money that should be in the trust account in an account that's not a trust account, converted to personal use, right? Having too much money in your trust account is a bad thing too. Either one of them is a trust account violation. They're both commingling. Anytime you're mixing your money with your client's money, it's a bad thing. You're not allowed to do that. Okay? So always keep trust funds separate. And the obligations or requirements for brokers might be a little bit different based on their status. If you are a BIC, your responsibility is to maintain the trust account, to make sure it's balanced, to make sure that all the rules are being followed, to make sure the funds are being deposited in the trust account. That's your responsibility. Can you have a licensed assistant do that for you? Yes, absolutely. Can you have an unlicensed assistant do that for you?
Yes.
Yes, as long as you are what?
Salary.
Responsible and salaried. That's a good answer. Salaried and responsible. The broker in charge has to be responsible for it, no matter who does it for them. It's their responsibility ultimately. If I'm a provisional broker, my responsibility is to turn those funds over to the BIC, and how long? Immediately. Immediately. If I'm a full broker, I need to turn those funds over to the BIC or to whoever's managing the escrow account as soon as possible. And I'll go ahead and tell you what the latest possible is. It's 3 banking days after you've received the money. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the trust account rules. But in general, you have 3 banking days to deposit any trust funds. Somebody give me an example of some types of money that would belong to your client that you might hold in trust. Earnest money deposits, absolutely. So escrow, I'm assuming you meant like an earnest money deposit there.
Yeah.
Okay? Earnest money deposits, a great example when you might hold a client's money in trust. We haven't talked much about leases, but how about a tenant security deposit? Security deposit would be an example of holding somebody's money in trust. And even further than that with leases, if I'm the property manager and I'm collecting rent, is it my rent that I'm collecting or is it my client's rent that I'm collecting?
Your client's rent.
your client's rent. And in general, any money that you touch that belongs to somebody else, with the exception of one thing, and that's a due diligence fee, any money you touch that belongs to somebody else, where's the first place it goes? In the trust account.
Yeah, and on our leases, we have to disclose where we have our trust.
Where,
account.
absolutely, where the
Where
trust
your
is
money's
located,
going.
where the money is sitting. And not, if it's a tenant security deposit, I'm going a little bit too deep in the woods, not in SECU, for example, right?
Right.
Because for those of you who have studied trust account rules, it has to be an FDIC insured institution. That's one of the rules. In fact, I had that argument with somebody the other day who had a lease and they had the tenant security deposit at Coastal Federal Credit Union. I said, you cannot do that. And he said, they're insured. I said, they are insured, but it's not FDIC insurance, and that's what the state law says. It has to be FDIC insured. So when you manage properties for SECU, do y'all have to maintain a trust account at an outside institution?
Yes.
Isn't that funny?
That's-
They can't hold their they can't hold their own tenant security deposits because they're not FDIC insured. It's crazy, but it's the way it works. Where do you have it? At Wells? Could be worse. Could be Bank of America, where mine is. It's like dance with the devil there, boy. I'm telling you. Oh God! The only reason I keep my trust account there is because their online banking cannot be beat. But it's still Bank of America, and I swear they drive me crazy. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I have shredded a debit card. They keep sending me debit cards on my trust account. I'm like, what part of this is a trust account? Do you not understand? I don't need a debit card on my trust account.
Wow.
It's something that needs to exist, right?
Here's a debit card.
You're right. And they sent it to me the week before Christmas. No, take it back. I don't want it. I do not want that. I don't even know. I'm like, it's labeled trust account. Don't send me the debt. Well, you've never used your debit card for good reason. There's no earthly reason to use a trust account debit card. Okay. All right, so no commingling when you are accounting for their funds. And then the last sort of catch-all for our duties is skill, care, and diligence. Provide reliable information on the transaction. And this second note is probably the most important one for skill, care, and diligence that I put in here. It said brokers are judged based on what a reasonable broker would have done in the same situation. If you ever find yourself, accused of a license law violation or of not representing your client's best interest, and you're in front of the real estate commission, what they will do is they will have a discussion about, okay, what would a reasonably knowledgeable agent in the same situation have done? And if you did something different than what they decide a reasonable agent would have done in the same situation, they're probably going to find that you violated the license law. For example, if you're in front of the real estate commission and you were accused of not disclosing zoning on a commercial purchase, and the buyer gets in there and finds out they can't use the property for what they wanted to use the property for, well, they would probably call 4 or 5 commercial brokers as witnesses and say, what would you do regarding the zoning on a property before you allowed a buyer to complete the transaction? And if all 5 of them said, well, we would disclose the zoning and say you couldn't use it for this purpose, does that seem pretty reasonable that a reasonable broker in that same situation would have disclosed the zoning? That's the way they handle those kinds of cases. So we're always kind of judged based on what other brokers in the same situation would have done. We are expected to be knowledgeable in a broad range of real estate matters obtained through our education and our experience. But the biggest thing is, and it's probably the hardest lesson to learn, I think, as a broker, remember your license is one license fits all. When you're licensed in North Carolina, there's not a license for property management, and a license for residential sales, and a license for commercial real estate. It's like getting a driver's license and being able to drive school buses, limousines, motorcycles, all of it with that one driver's license. Just because you have the license in your pocket doesn't mean you have the skills required to do the job. Don't ever forget that, and don't ever forget that you're going to be judged against your peers, not against, you can't say, well, I didn't know. Well, if you go do a commercial transaction and you've never worked in commercial real estate and you make a mistake, that a normal, well-versed commercial broker would not have made, they're going to hold you responsible for that mistake. Is that fair enough? Does that make sense for everybody? So be careful about practicing in areas where you're not knowledgeable, where you're not comfortable until you learn what's going on. All right? Always provide competent advice regarding a property's value. That is part of your skill, care, and diligence. We should advise our clients on the value of properties, no matter what kind of property it is. Okay? They have a right to rely on us for that estimate of value, and to not give every client some opinion of value, some estimate of value would be a violation of your duty as a broker. That's one of the biggest things they rely on us for, some opinion of the value of the property. Okay? Keep all the records, and how long do we say we keep the records for?
3 years.
3 years from the end of the transaction, absolutely. Effectively advertise, make sure you're advertising the property. So if it's a residential property, what's probably the most effective way to advertise a residential property? In MLS. So would you say that somebody who takes a listing as a residential broker who's not a realtor and doesn't have access to the MLS is probably not representing their client to the best interest possible? Yeah, and I think the Real Estate Commission would probably agree with that. So you'd probably want to make sure you had in writing with that client, you understand that your property's not going to be listed in the MLS, and that's probably the biggest piece of marketing for a residential property. So you'd be covered there if you were going to do something like that, for example.
Why would somebody do that?
Good question. It's a good question. You know, lots of brokers aren't realtors because the real money of being a real estate agent is being a realtor. I mean, you guys pay $420 to take this class or whatever amount you paid, and you'll pay $100 and some to take the exam, and you got your license. Great. You think you're free and clear with the money. No, no, no. Most of you, the big expense will be joining the Association of Realtors. It's $1,000 a year in dues to the association. So lots of brokers who don't do a lot of business choose not to be realtors. Somebody may approach them and say, hey, can you help me sell my house? Why they would say yes to that, I do not know if they're not a realtor, but some would. And that's not going to be good if you don't inform that client, hey, you know, the most effective piece of marketing is not going to be done on your property. You're not going to be listed in the MLS. May as well be a for sale by owner at that point for the most part, right? Okay? Advise our principal about offers, all of them. That's a really important piece of the job for us, to make sure our clients get good advice about any potential offers. And that means offers even after we're under contract. After offers come in later after that, the seller still needs to be made aware of any and all offers. If it comes in on an old form, an outdated form, if it comes in written in crayon on a napkin, whatever, if it's an offer, you have to present it to the seller. You don't have the authority to make a decision on an offer. Not presenting an offer is the same thing as making a decision, right? When you agree, not presenting it is the same thing as rejecting it. In fact, I had a conversation earlier today with a buyer in Edgecombe County. I grew up in Edgecombe County, and somebody I went to high school with, they messaged me on Facebook, of all places. And they said, you know, they had a question. They were trying to make an offer on a property in my hometown, and the broker would not present their offer. I said, well, why not? She said, well, it's already under contract, but it was supposed to have closed. And Tarboro is a really small town, so everybody knows everybody's business, right? It was supposed to have closed about 3 weeks ago, and the buyer is waiting on some settlement from a lawsuit that she was supposed to have got way back when, and it's been strung out, and she's telling everybody it's going to take at least another 6 weeks to get it, and this thing keeps getting delayed, and I know what she's under contract for on the property, and I'm willing to pay more than that anyway, and this listing broker won't even present my offer. Is that listing broker doing their job?
No.
No, absolutely not, because might that other buyer be asking for extensions to the closing date on that transaction? Yeah, they may be asking for extensions. Does the seller need to know that there's another potential buyer out there who doesn't need all these extensions?
Yeah.
Would that affect their decision making?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so to refuse to present that offer, number one, it's very clearly stated in state law, you present all offers. But even if it wasn't stated, it's pretty clear you're not working in the best interest of your client if you don't give them all the available information. Now, why that agent is taking that tact, I have no earthly idea, but they certainly aren't following the law by doing it. My guess is, just a guess, that if you got down into it, you might find some dual agency involved in that transaction. That broker might be representing the seller and that buyer, and they're trying to protect their buyer client. Just guessing, you know. I've been around a few times. I've seen how those things play out.
Is there a recourse for that person?
Well, she asked me, what do you do? And I said, well, if it was me, I would give the broker a last opportunity to do the right thing. And in a very nice way, say, listen, I understand you're breaking the law. And if you would like to rethink your position and present my offer, I'll be happy to let bygones be bygones. But I'm going to insist that you present my offer. And if you won't, then I'm going to go knock on the door and I'm going to present the offer to them right after I get off the phone with the real estate commission at 919-875-3700, and I gave her the phone number, and file a complaint for you not presenting this offer. So they're going to see so if it was me, what I would do, I would tell them they're going to see the offer no matter what, because either I'm going to present it myself to your sellers because you won't, and good luck with you making, who are you going to complain to about that? I'm not doing my job, so I'm mad at them that they did it for me, right? That would essentially be what the broker would be mad about. And so I'm hoping that the broker will, see the light of day. I said, now, if it was me, knowing how the situation's played out, even if the broker says, well, I presented your offer and they rejected it, I'd probably want to see something signed that said they had seen it and rejected it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how does that person know that they didn't?
They have actually presented that offer. Yeah, I mean, and I said, well, how do you have I said, Casey, how do you have all this information about the transaction? She said, you've forgotten what it's like to live here. Everybody knows everything. I said, well, use that same grapevine to your advantage and tell everybody who knows everything, hey, I'm willing to pay a lot more money for this house, and it will get back to them too. I would imagine they'll seek you out at that point in time. But it's amazing what some brokers do. Honestly, don't do stuff like that.
And so then the then the owner of the house, the seller, has the option to what when that new offer comes in?
Well, they can always accept it as a backup contract. If they accepted it as a backup contract and then the primary contract fell apart because it couldn't close by the agreed upon closing date, then they could just terminate the deal because the buyer's not ready to move forward, and they could accept the backup contract as a primary contract.
Couldn't they technically get out of the contract anyway, because they could say, well, you didn't present me this offer and you breached our exclusive...
They can't get out of, they can get out of their listing contract. They probably could get out of paying a commission and doing all that. But remember, you're not going to harm a third party because the broker screwed up. So getting them out of the sales contract would harm the buyer in this case. So they have whatever rights they have under that contract with the buyer, they have regardless of how much the broker is screwing things up. Now the truth is, if the buyer is not ready to close and not going to close for so many weeks, and the seller just says, no, I'm not giving you an extension, then that's going to be the same as effectively getting out of the contract, because they don't have to grant an extension. But here's my fear, and this is my fear of what's happening in that situation. The seller is probably granting the extension because you're in an area where things don't sell very commonly, right? There's not a big booming market in Edgecombe County. There's probably like 3 things that sold last year in Tarboro. And so the seller is probably trying to do everything they can to work with this buyer, completely unaware that there's somebody else out there that could be a better solution for them because they're not being presented that information by their listing broker for whatever reason. Who knows what the motivation is. Okay? Assist with contract preparation. That does not mean you draft language, of course. You fill in the blanks on pre-printed contract. It is expected that we give them with appropriate sales contract advice and assist in the completion. And make sure we work with the sellers to counteroffer and help them from their perspective understand the offer that they have in front of them.
That was the question I had.
Yep.
Okay, if there's a counter offer, so I offer to buy your house.
Yep,
And you counter back, does my offer is no longer?
that is correct. That is correct. And yet, as we get into the specifics
So
of
I can't-
offers and the
So
contract,
you can't go back and say, okay, they didn't accept my counter offer, I'll take their original offer.
no, you cannot. Does everybody understand what her question is? Her question is essentially, does a counter offer kill the original offer? And the answer is absolutely. An unequivocal yes, it does. Any counter offer. So this is the other thing that brokers get wrong so often, and therefore the public gets it wrong. I love this response. Well, we accept your offer, but we want to change the closing date to this. Then you don't what?
Accept the
You
offer.
don't accept our offer. See, an offer is a take it or leave it proposition. Now, that doesn't mean you can't negotiate. What that means is there's no such thing as we accept but. That doesn't exist. It's either we accept, we reject, or we counteroffer. Those are the only three options when you get an offer. Because any counteroffer is, first and foremost, a what? A rejection. Any counteroffer is a rejection of the original offer. Okay?
It's just like a plat map, right?
That's right, it's just like a plat map. Any change obliterates the whole and creates a whole new offer. You know, even if it's the slightest little change. Now, we all understand what we mean when we say, you know, well, my clients accept all that, but we want to work on this. The key is understand that's not binding at that point in time because you've obliterated that first offer with that change. Does that make? It's fine to have the conversation. Just don't walk away from the conversation and think we've actually accepted something when you actually counteroffer. That's where the problems come in. So what I recommend is don't use that language. Don't say we've accepted but. The way I term it and try to discipline myself is to say, my clients are agreeable to this, 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 and this, but we would like to counteroffer you on these terms right here. So I haven't said we've accepted, I've said we're agreeable to. So it's very clear that we're not accepting, that we're actually making you a counteroffer. Okay? And other points, wrapping up this duties to our principals. The value of the property or our amount of our compensation has nothing to do with our duties. Our duties do not end when the contract is signed. In fact, most of our brokerage services usually happen after the contract is signed. We represent them all the way to closing. And agents need to cooperate with each other in order to facilitate closing. That last one should be self-evident, but sometimes you get folks who get territorial and want to have cat fights. Make sure that you are cooperating. Any questions about duties that we owe our clients? Okay. So we want to move on now to disclosure. And disclosure is probably the biggest part of our job, particularly if you start listing property. If you're a listing broker, disclosure is a huge part of what you do. Disclosure is a huge part of what you do if you're on the buyer side as well. But particularly for listing brokers, disclosure will always be one of the biggest parts of the job. And our slide here says that we have a duty to make a full and prompt disclosure of all material facts known to the agent. So a material fact is something that the state defines as needing to be disclosed. And we're going to talk about the different categories of material facts. But for right now, the definition of a material fact is something that the state of North Carolina says should be disclosed to a potential buyer in that transaction. That's a material fact. Okay? We have a duty to not only disclose them, but we have a duty to, what does that word say? Discover these material facts that we should have known about. So we have a duty to disclose the ones that we do know about. We have a duty to discover ones that we should have known about. So I'll give you an example of the kinds of things that you should have known about. If you list a house, and literally there's not a single door in the house that will close without sticking or falling open, or that none of the latches line up, what would you suspect is going on with that house, potentially? Some kind of a foundation issue, right? Clearly the house has shifted substantially. If every door sticks or falls open or won't close, something's going on with the foundation that needs to be investigated. Now, if you choose to ignore that obvious sign, now, do I know that there's a problem with the foundation? No. But at bare minimum, I should probably be disclosing to buyers that we suspect there may be some sort of a foundation issue, or I should have somebody investigate and see if there's a foundation issue. Does that make sense? So that's what we mean when we say things that we should have known about. You got to follow up on those sort of red flags, those things that bring your attention to it. We have a duty to disclose all offers and the identity of the purchaser, so the seller should know who's trying to purchase their property. A duty to disclose any relationship with any of the offerors, and a duty to disclose if the property is going to be resold for a profit. So if we know that the buyer, for example, a flip, if we know for certain, we're the listing broker, and we know that that buyer is planning to buy that property and fix it up and flip it, we have to disclose that to the seller. Why do you think that is important to disclose to the seller?
It may, because they may not want their property to be, it's gonna affect their decision as to whether they want, that buyer to buy their
It could
property.
affect your decision on whether they want that buyer. I'll tell you another decision it might affect. Might they decide, well, if somebody else can flip it and make more money off of it, maybe I should flip it myself. You see what I mean?
Right.
So if you know for certain that that's going to be the outcome, you have to disclose it because it could influence their decision making. So,
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
So you said, can you go back to disclose
Yep.
the identity of the person who's making the offer? Just, you mean their name,
yes,
not about them?
no, you don't have to go Facebook stalk them.
Okay.
No, you just you
Because
give them
then,
their
when
name.
then that comes into like when you're getting multiple offers and you're picking your offer based on that person's lifestyle, possibly.
And here's the thing: the seller is free to do that.
Okay.
You're not free to present it candored by that, but the seller is free to make that determination for themselves. But they have a right to know who the offerors are. All right. Good question, though. Good? Okay. All right. So, disclosure of information, material facts. We said material facts are things that the state said need to be disclosed. Now we're going to break down what those categories of material facts are. We're going to give more definition to them so that you understand these are the things that I need to disclose. Now, these are material facts that we disclose to the public, aka everybody. So if a material fact falls in one of these four categories right here, then that material fact is going to be disclosed to everybody involved in the transaction, whether we represent that person or whether they're a third party or customer and we don't represent them. Okay? So the first category, facts about the property itself. Okay? Facts about the property. It's broke. It doesn't work anymore. The roof leaks. There's an electrical problem. There's a plumbing leak. There's a foundational problem. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about here. These are the defects in the property. The septic system's got tree roots growing through the lines. All of those are examples of facts about the property itself, and they clearly must be disclosed to everybody involved in the transaction. This is one of those things where you're going to get an unlawful command from your client. I don't want you to tell them about that. Do you have a choice?
If you in the beginning tell your client, don't tell me, because if you tell me, I have to tell them.
Well, that's true, and don't forget though, you still have a reasonable duty to discover any of those
Right,
defects.
well, let's just say they have, a leaking roof, but there's no obvious signs of a leaking roof. Then you don't, I mean, if they don't tell you and you know, unless,
Right.
because there's no way to know there's leaking roof unless you got water stains
Well,
someplace.
I think the way to, I don't think you're trying to say anything insidious there at all. So here's what I would say about the way I explain things to my client. I say to them, listen, I'm obligated to disclose what I know about the property, or if I see any red flags about anything that would tell me you have a problem with anything. You're not obligated to disclose anything. So whatever you put on your disclosure form is not going to influence what I say at all. If I see a problem, I'm going to follow up on that problem, and if there is an issue, we're going to disclose it because I have to. So I think we're sort of saying the same thing there.
So let's say they have a leaking roof, they've had a contractor out to tell them it's gonna cost them $1,000 to fix
Yep.
the roof. But they don't tell you that and there's no obvious signs. if the people who buy the house come back and they haven't disclosed the roof leaks, is it on them to have to fix it?
Well, they should have a home.
It depends on,
Right.
it depends on how they've answered the question about their leaky roof on the disclosure statement. Because they haven't gotten to the disclosure statement yet, but the disclosure statement allows them to answer in 3 different ways. Yes, there's a problem. No, there's not a problem. Or I'm not providing any representation at all about whether there is a problem or not. There's 3 possible answers. If they've checked no representation, is the seller ever obligated to disclose?
No.
No. They can check no representation. Here's what they can't do. They can't lie. So if they check no, there's not a problem, and we later find out, yes, there was a problem, and yes, they were aware of it, then absolutely they can be held responsible for that. Okay? Make sense? Good. So these kinds of things, facts about the property must be disclosed to everybody. The second category of things that must be disclosed to everybody, facts that relate directly to the property. So facts that relate directly to the property would be like things like zoning. What's the property zoned for? Are there zoning changes going on? Covenants. Disclosure of covenants falls into this category. So the covenants need to be disclosed to everybody who's involved in the transaction. Okay? Plans to widen streets, plans to do development in the area. For example, some of these things would hurt your client. I'll give you an example. Let's say I work with Sheetz gas station, and I'm their buyer's agent, their exclusive buyer's agent. So whose interest am I representing?
The buyer.
The buyer, Sheetz, right? And Sheetz comes to me and says, listen, we've got some sort of advance notice about where they're going to put the exits on the new 540 down in southern Wake County, and we've targeted 3 different locations where we'd like to purchase some land so that we can build stores there when they open the freeway up finally in 47 years from now when it happens. Okay? We're down to 47 years now. I was saying 147 a couple years ago, so we've shaved some time off of that. But they come to you and they want you to go approach these people who don't have their property on the market. Maybe they're farmers, and they want you to buy 5 acres here or 4 acres there so that they own that land when that road finally comes through. Do I, as the buyer's representative, working on the buyer's best interest, have to tell that seller why my client is interested particularly in their piece of property?
No, but you have to tell them who the client is.
I have to tell them who the client is, and I have to tell them about the roadway, because that's a material fact. So I don't have to say, my client Sheetz wants to put a gas station on your property. That's too much information, right? But what I have to tell them is, my client is making you an offer to purchase your property, and by the way, it's come to our attention that Interstate 540 is going to be going through that section of your property.
And if they can't make the link that
If
Sheetz
they,
is the client,
if they can't make that link, then that's on them.
shame on them.
But does everybody follow that? Now, Sheetz doesn't want me to make that disclosure, but I have to. I'm required to, because it's a fact about the property itself. Yes, ma'am?
This is a really long question. I saw a documentary on Disney World and how they purchased the land to build it. Would that be illegal that he had different people buying the land and not telling why, so that, because as soon as they found out, they jacked the prices up like 100%.
Right. No, absolutely not. That's how Walmart buys property every single day. Walmart doesn't tell you who they are when they come in. They come in and they buy options on the property as Blue Ribbon Properties or Sam's R Us, or who knows what kind of shell corporations they have that come in and buy options on the real estate at very low prices. And then once they've got the option contracts in the real estate, they announce to the world, hey, we're Walmart and we're here. You know, because if they did it the other way, what would happen to the prices? Skyrocket.
We had a house that we built in Ohio, and shortly before we were getting ready to sell the house, we got notice from the county that they were going to put city water down our street. But they didn't give us a time. It did, you know, and they'd actually been promising us like for years that was coming. We owned the house for 7 years, and every year we'd get the notice. So when we sold the house, we had to tell the people that you may be getting city water because they were going to have to pay the assessment if it came down.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You had to tell them, and you probably didn't want to tell them because it probably, in some ways, hurt the
They were
recent.
thrilled because they wanted citywide.
Oh, there you go.
We were lucky in that
Yeah.
occasion, but.
Good.
They didn't ask for any, they didn't ask for us to pay for any assessment at all.
Good, they just took
totally
it.
accepted.
Oh, nice, well, good for them. More power to them, right? So any kind of fact that would affect the marketability, the value, the usefulness of the property must be disclosed, okay? The third category of material facts that we have to disclose to everybody, the ability of our client to complete the transaction. Now, this is one your client really hates. Their ability to complete the transaction. Can they buy? Can they afford it? Can they qualify for a loan? You're obligated to present every offer your client wants to make. Let's be clear about that. If your buyer client wants to make an offer, you're obligated to present it. But if you know for a fact that they just went and applied for a mortgage loan and got denied, you have every obligation to tell that seller or seller's agent when you present that offer, my client is crazy. They just went and applied for a loan and they were denied. Now, you need to let your client know that that's what you're going to do when you present the offer, but you are obligated to present the offer.
Well, what if they offer, like they've been qualified for $100,000 and they're offering $3 on a house?
You're absolutely required to disclose that because, and you should tell them that. You should say, listen, guys, you need to go back and get an updated pre-qualification because to my knowledge, you've only been approved for a mortgage loan of $100,000 and you're making an offer that says you're going to get a $300,000 loan, and I have to tell them what's going on because it again affects the decision making on the other side of the transaction. Okay, buyers need to sell their existing home first. This is a big sticking point with some brokers in North Carolina. With the due diligence contract, when we changed to the due diligence contract, a lot of the contingencies went away. Somebody give me a definition of a contingency. What do you think a contingency is in a contract?
A has to happen before B happens.
A has to happen before B happens, right? And specifically in a sales contract is, if this doesn't happen, then I can get out of it. I don't have to. If I don't get a loan, then you got to let me out of the contract. If the inspections come back and something's broken and you won't fix it, then you got to let me out of the contract. Those are contingencies. Does everybody understand that? Okay. So the old contract that we utilized had a bunch of contingencies in there, and one of them was the contingent sale. If you told them that your offer was contingent on a sale, then if you didn't sell your property, you didn't have to go forward with this purchase. How do you think sellers view that kind of an offer? Not very favorably, right? Because they're like, well, wait, if I've got a buyer over here who doesn't need to sell something and a buyer here who does need to sell something, then I don't want to do that. Well, when we went to the due diligence contract, the ability of the buyer to walk away became sort of dangerous in this regard. A lot of brokers took it upon themselves to think, my buyer is paying for them to take their house off the market. It is none of their business whether or not my buyer needs to sell something first or not. And we don't need to tell them about it because even if they don't sell it, we can always do what?
Get an extension.
How about just walk away? Just terminate, right? Can they not just terminate during the due diligence period? Get a refund of their earnest money and move on with their lives? So a lot of brokers, not a lot, some brokers took it upon themselves to always say, oh no, my client doesn't need to sell anything, when they really did. Folks, you can't do that. It doesn't matter if they're still protected by the due diligence. That's not the point. The point is letting the seller know the truthful nature of the situation, which is that the buyer does have to sell something else before they can buy. And on the seller's side, if you find out for any reason the seller might not be able to provide a clear and marketable title. I have one of those going on right now where the title work was just done on one of my listings, and there is an old mortgage lien from 22 years ago hanging out there that's been paid, but Chase never filed a satisfaction of lien. So there's a $60,000 lien sitting out there on the property, and we're trying to get it removed. Well, I have to call the agent on the other side of the transaction and say, look, right now we can't give you good, clear title. We're working on it. We're trying to fix it, but right now we can't. Any questions about that? Sorry. Questions about those? And then the last category of material facts that have to be disclosed to everybody, something that's of special importance to the buyer, the seller. And the example I give you here is somebody wanting to use their home as a home office, for example. Somebody wants to use their home for a home business. Maybe somebody does cosmetology, cuts hair, does those kinds of services, and they want to do that in their home in addition to living there. And they tell you that. Well, guess what? Do you think it now might be your responsibility to verify with zoning that they can do that thing that they want to do? It's not normally considered a material fact whether the property has a septic system or is attached to the city sewer. Now, you should disclose it, right? But you don't make a point of going, now this house has a septic system. That's not normally considered a material fact unless there's some problem with the septic system. There's a defect. But what if a client says to you, look, I absolutely don't want anything with a septic tank? Is that now a material fact for that client?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So anything that they make a point to say, this is especially important to me. Okay? Now, we get into I call them the whoopsies, the mistakes involving material facts. And these are on page 149 through 151. And I cannot emphasize enough how these are going to be tested. Okay? These negligent and willful omissions and misrepresentations that we're about to talk about are absolutely going to be tested very heavily. And so you need to know the difference between a misrepresentation and an omission. You're going to get at least one test question, and it will be a long one, where they tell you somebody's entire life story and the history of listing this property. And they're going to try to convince you that it's one thing, and then it's the other, and then it goes back to the first. And you've got to decide, is this a misrepresentation or an omission? So let's talk about what a misrepresentation is. A misrepresentation is a wrongful statement of fact. The broker in question has said, typed, written, somehow communicated something incorrectly about a material fact. They said it, and it was what?
Wrong.
Wrong. That's a misrepresentation. Don't worry yet about whether it was on purpose or they did it because it was out. We ain't there yet. Back the bus up. First thing you need to know is it a misrepresentation or is it an omission? So the key to a misrepresentation is that they did what? They said something wrong. An omission is they left it out, but they should have said something. Do you see the difference between the two? A misrepresentation is they did say something and that something was wrong. And omission is they left it out, but they should have disclosed. So I'll give you an example of the same material fact as a misrepresentation and as an omission. A leaky roof. I list a property for sale, and I walk through the property, and it turns out the property has a leak. We're not going to talk about how I found out or if I know. We're not worried about that yet. Okay, that's for later on. But the property does have a leak. And I show a buyer the property, and I don't say anything to the buyer about the leak. What is that? It's an omission. What if the buyer later on calls me back and says, yeah, go put your windows up, Karen. Let me remind you of that. Karen called me, I'm gonna tell on her now while she's outside. She called me on Sunday and she said, can I borrow your shop vac? And I said, sure, why? Y'all remember Saturday night? It rained a little bit, right? She said, I left my windows all the way down in my car. She had 2 inches of standing water in the floorboard of her car on Sunday morning. So she's got her windows down out there now because she's still trying to dry it out. I'm like, yeah, go put them up. Don't let it rain in there again.
Mold will happen so fast.
I know. She's been vacuuming it out and putting cat litter in there and all, just anything to try to dry it. I'm like, I told her, trade it. Go sell it. So that was my departure from the topic for today. So the buyer calls me and says, I'm thinking about making an offer. Hey, I have a question for you though. How old is the roof? Are there any problems with the roof? And I say, No, if the roof's about 6 years old, there's no problems with it.
Misrepresentation.
That's a misrepresentation. Same material fact, right?
Right.
What if you got that same thing all in one question? Which one is it? Because this is what people just struggle with on tests. They're like, well, it's both. No, it's not both. What is it? It's a misrepresentation. Yes, I know it started as an omission. I know first I walked into the house and I didn't say anything, but eventually I did say something that was wrong. And if I ever said anything, what is it? It's a misrepresentation. Is everybody comfortable with
So
that?
any communication
That's incorrect.
regarding is considered misrepresentation.
That is correct, absolutely. If I ever communicate anything regarding this material fact that's wrong, it's a misrepresentation. I don't care that it started as an omission, because a lot of people look at it and say, oh, well, they didn't put it in the MLS listing, so it must be an omission. But yeah, they didn't put it in the MLS listing, and that was an omission, but the buyer followed it up by asking them about it, and they said, no, there are no problems. So it just changed from omission to misrepresentation. Does everybody follow that? Okay, so the first thing you have to ask yourself is this mistake that was made a misrepresentation, or is it an omission? Then we get to
Can I ask a
this.
question?
Yep.
So say the kind of the same situation you just said, but say that you didn't know the roof was faulty. So you didn't say or convey it. So, but in omissions it says you should have known. But in misrepresentation it doesn't say you should have known. Is that just
Because in
the-
misrepresentation it doesn't matter whether you should have known or not, because you actually conveyed wrong information.
Okay.
Okay? The key to a misrepresentation is you conveyed wrong information. It doesn't matter if it was information that you should have known or information that you shouldn't have known.
Okay.
Anytime you convey incorrect information, that's a misrepresentation. That makes sense for you? Okay? Now, the next part of this puzzle is, was our mistake willful or was our mistake negligent? Willful means on purpose. We did it knowing that what we were doing was wrong. Negligent means we didn't know we were making a mistake, but we what? Should have known. That's negligence. A willful mistake is one where we knew. I knew right then when I was doing that I shouldn't have been doing it. That's willful. Negligent means I should have known. I didn't know, but I should have known. So, backing up, first we need to decide, is it a what? An omission or a misrepresentation. And then second, we need to decide, is it willful or is it negligent? And only after you have done that two-step process do you put them all together. And that's where the answers to your questions are going to be. These are multiple choice questions. There are 4 answer choices. What 4 answer choices do you think there will be in a question like this?
Those 4.
Those 4. Willful omission, negligent omission, willful misrepresentation, negligent misrepresentation. So let me spin you a little yarn here and see which one you think it is. Travis lists the property at 123 Main Street in Garner. Upon listing the property, he walks through the house with the seller and he notices some water staining on the roof of the upstairs hallway. Inquiring to the seller about the water staining, the seller informs Travis that there is an active leak in the roof that's been there for the last 6 months. However, it's not a bad leak, and so it shouldn't be too much of an issue to any potential buyer. Travis lists the property in the MLS and neglects to mention the leak in the roof in the MLS listing. The property does not sell for the next 18 months, though the seller continues to renew the listing with Travis's firm. Approximately 18 months after listing, Travis is showing a buyer-client the property, and the buyer-client inquires about the staining on the roof. Having forgotten about the conversation he had with the sellers and having forgotten about the active leak in the roof, Travis responds that there are no known problems with the roof. So, answer choices are going to be willful misrepresentation, negligent misrepresentation, willful omission, negligent omission. What's the first step? Decide if it's what?
Misrepresentation.
If it's a misrepresentation or an omission. So, talk me through it. Which one is it? It's a misrepresentation. Why is it a misrepresentation? Man, I told you he forgot to put it in the MLS.
So sorry.
Yeah, you still knew that at one point in time. It was
That's not about what I knew.
You communicated.
It's still wrong.
I communicated. See, and that's why I have to stop you. It's not about what I know or don't know yet at this point, because that's where you get confused and you get off the tracks with these things. The first question is simply, did I communicate something? And what is the answer to that?
Yes.
Yes, I did, because the buyer asked me about the water stain. And what did I tell the buyer?
No problem.
There were no problems. So did I misrepresent the situation to that buyer?
Yes.
Yes, I know it started as an omission. I get that. And trust me, that's why they put it in the daggum question, because they know that's what you're going to latch on to, the omission part of it. Yes, it was an omission. And if the buyer had never asked about the roof, would it have been an omission? Yes, because if it was just never said, right? But the dynamic changed when the buyer asked the question. So you have to ask yourself, did he communicate? And the answer in this case is
Yes.
yes. So what is it? It's a misrepresentation. Now let's do part two. Is it willful or is it negligent? Now the definition of willful, a licensee is willful when they know what they're doing is wrong at the time they're doing it. And a definition of negligence is, a licensee is negligent when they make a mistake because they did not know, but should have known. So let's walk through that thing. Did Travis know about the leak? He walked through the house, he had a conversation with the seller told him there was a leak in the roof. Later on, he's walking through with the buyer asked him about the roof, he's forgotten because it's been so long, and he tells them that there's no problem. Is that willful or is it negligent?
It's
Negligent.
It's negligent. Don't let them talk you into that being willful, because he knew at one point about, the key to willfulness is that you know right then, in that moment, when he said there's no problems with the roof, in the back of his mind he's thinking, yeah, as long as you put a new one there ain't no problems, right? That he literally, he knows what he's saying is wrong
So
in
it's
that
purposeful.
moment.
Like
It's purposeful.
he
It is
thinks,
a
I do
lie.
know
It
that,
is
but
just
it's
a
a lie.
lie.
So at the beginning, it was a willful admission that became a negligent misrepresentation.
In the beginning, it was
Because he was told that there was something wrong with the roof and he did not put-
probably a willful omission in the beginning that ended up being a negligent misrepresentation. Yeah, that's probably a good way to look at it. You know, based on the totality of the information at the end, it was a negligent misrepresentation. Yes, ma'am.
It also says in the book though that if they should reasonably have known it's negligent, even if they didn't at the time.
Right, exactly. That they reasonably, and for him, that's why this is a perfect example of reasonably should have known. Did he know that there was a leak in the roof when he said, no, there are no problems?
He did, somewhere in the back of his mind.
But not actively, right? Because if he actively knew, it would have been willful. Does that make sense? So the answer is no, he didn't know, but he what?
Should've.
He should have, because
There was
they
leaks.
told him. Right? Does that make sense for everybody? So make sure, because you're definitely going to get that as a test question. Not that specific example, but you're going to get a misrepresentation omission test question. So you should be able to sort through those.
Where does it come into play, and you might go over this in just a few slides, but where does it come into play when it's something, like that roof example makes perfect sense, because the whole reason he discovered that is because it was clear that there were water stains on the roof.
Water stains on the
But what
ceiling.
if it's like, where does it come in where it's like a hot water heater and you don't know anything about hot water heaters? There's no way you would.
You get back to that reasonableness standard.
Right,
What would a
right.
reasonable agent have known? I mean, if the hot water heater had rust all around the bottom of it and was sitting in a puddle of water,
Right.
Should you reasonably
Yes.
have known that there was some issue with the water heater?
Or how old it was.
The age of it, yeah, that could always, be a key. For example, if you go list a property in the middle of summer and you walk in there and the windows are all open and it's 98 degrees outside, I'm asking them why they don't have the air conditioning on. For two reasons. Number one, I don't want to be in there. Number one, I don't want to list your house if this is what it's going to be like for me showing it. Number two, I need to know if the AC works, because if it doesn't, we have to do what? Disclose it. And wouldn't you say that's probably a red flag if you walk in somebody's house in the middle of summer and they don't have the air conditioning on?
What if you walk in during November and it feels fine and you don't know that?
Then you don't have a reasonable
That's what I meant.
red flag. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that weighs into that decision. Because remember, it's going to be the real estate commission making these decisions. They're making a judgment call here. Yeah.
Was that kind of like when I was looking at places and like we looked at a house that was built, I think in 92, and he said to be careful with the houses that were built, and I could have the dates off a little bit, but we'll just say in the early 90s because of the pipes that were used.
Polybutylene?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, so for example, polybutylene is an example of a material fact even if there's no problem with it. The state has said there are certain things that are a problem even if they're not a problem. And polybutylene piping is one of those
Yes,
things.
and he was telling me about.
Yeah.
He
You
said,
have to disclose it even if there's it's not leaking, it's not doing anything. Because basically what you're telling somebody is you're going to have problems.
Yeah, he was like, stay clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Polybutylene is not.
Well, one of the examples they gave in the book was that they had a problem with the polybutylene pipe. I think it was actually one of the questions. That had been fixed.
Yes.
But you still have to tell them.
You still have to tell them. That's exactly right. The only way you would not have to disclose at all is if there was no more polybutylene piping in the house. If it had been completely removed, because then there's nothing to disclose about it. But generally speaking, polybutylene, it's the joints that fail. And so for a long time, people say, oh, well, if the joints have been replaced, we don't need to disclose anything. And the state has now said, no, that's not the case. If there's polybutylene anything in there, you need to disclose it. Here's the reason polybutylene is considered a ticking time bomb. It does not get along well with chlorine. And nobody knew that when it was originally manufactured. And over time, chlorine tends to make it brittle and hard and deteriorate it from the inside out. Well, municipal water supplies tend to have a lot of chlorine in them. And so what happens is these pipes just rupture all of a sudden because you look at them, they look fine from the outside because they're actually being deteriorated from the inside. And so that's the problem with polybutylene pipe. And that's why the state says you've got to disclose it. Because eventually, they're going to rupture. Eventually. For sure. All right, is everybody good on the misrepresentation and omission thing? Okay? You're definitely going to be tested on it. You want to make sure you don't miss that. So, there are some things that are not material facts and do not need to be disclosed. Now, when I point these out, I want to point out that that doesn't mean you're forbidden from disclosing them. Most of these things you're allowed to disclose, but you're not required to. Now, I'm going to give you my 2 cents on that and you can take it for what it's worth, which ain't much. If I'm not required to disclose it, guess what I'm not doing with it? I'm not touching it. I'm not disclosing it. Because I'm held responsible for any disclosure I make. And there's no need to put yourself on the hook for something that you don't have to be on the hook for. So examples of things that are not material facts. Somebody died in the house. Somebody committed suicide in the house. That is not a material fact. Now, if your client said to you, it is very important that I not buy a house that somebody committed suicide in, can they make it a material fact?
Yeah.
Yes, but outside of that, it's not. Okay? You can't lie. You can't say, oh, no. You just don't have to actively disclose unless you're specifically asked. And even if you're specifically asked, you could say, well, I would prefer not to disclose that unless the client says, well, it's very important to me that I not buy a house that had this, and then they've made it a material fact. Okay? So if somebody died in there, somebody was sick in there, convicted sex offender living nearby. The presence of a registered sex offender is not a material fact in North Carolina. And you should be very careful about this because if you disclose incorrect information, you can get sued by people for incorrectly labeling them as a sex offender type thing. So what I would do if somebody has this concern is send them to the state sex offender registry, and you can show them how it works. You can let them use your computer. You can say, look, here's how you research it. If that's important to you, I'll help you get the data, and then you make a decision rather than you do the work and say, oh, there's a sex offender who lives here, Thomas Brown, and he was convicted. Don't do that. That's too much. Okay? The fact that a current or former occupant had AIDS or HIV would be an example of something that's not a material fact, or a haunted house. I love that one. I love how you'd be held responsible for a haunted house.
Like
you know.
AIDS or HIV, that's considered a disability.
It is, and we're going to talk about that when we get in the handicapping, the fair housing section. You actually can't disclose that. That's the one on here that you can't disclose because that's considered a handicapping condition. But the haunted house one is my favorite for sure. You know, people say, well, you can disclose if it's haunted. I'm like, but you're held responsible for whatever. How are you going to prove that? Right? You know, like, it's haunted. I've got proof.
It's appealing to some people.
I guess it is appealing, but again, you know, what are they going to sue me and say, you promised me a haunted house? I haven't seen a ghost yet.
God.
I don't know how that would work.
You could always say something like, well, there's rumors.
Yeah, right, exactly. The light went on when I went in the room. Right. We have a duty to properly account for funds held in trust. We already talked about that. A duty to competently perform our services, and a duty to avoid improper conduct. Okay, we've already done that. Why that slide's there. Additional fact. Thank you. Fine. I think I had an extra slide in there somewhere. There's two. Additional facts that should be disclosed to the principal. Anybody's willingness to do something better, to accept a different price, a higher price, a lower price. If you know, for example, that the buyer has presented one offer but they're willing to pay more, and you represent the seller, should you not tell the seller that information? Of course, because you represent the seller. A third party's motivation for engaging in the transaction, that has to be disclosed to your principal. And any other information that you think might affect the principal or client's rights or decision making. Got to disclose it. The last thing in Chapter 8 here is a discussion of the relationship, I'm sorry, Chapter 7, we're still at the end of Chapter 7, is the relationship between the BIC and brokers in the firm. And it starts the discussion of what brokers in charge are responsible for. We talked somewhat about this in the license law section the other night. It says the broker in charge is responsible for all of the advertising, brokerage activity, and maintaining active licensure of the brokers within the firm. I would highlight that last part, and maintaining active licensure in the brokers within the firm. So if we get a question later on in the class and we say, is the BIC responsible for making sure brokers take their continuing education? What do you think the answer to that question is?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The BIC is additionally responsible for all of the actions of a provisional broker. It says provisional brokers cannot actively participate in the business unless they have a supervising broker in charge. So basically, a provisional broker's license is completely useless without a BIC. And then full brokers, or the technical term of non-provisional broker, are more responsible for their own actions. They can be on active status and be paid without having a BIC, but they still need to be associated with one if they want to actively represent the public. Yes, ma'am?
This might be a stupid question, but when it says that the BIC has to supervise a provisional broker, does that mean that they have to physically be there whenever they do anything?
No, it's a good question. She wanted to know if the BIC has to physically be with a provisional broker who's transacting business. The answer is no. They just have to be actively involved and providing advice along the way. Okay? So that last thing, that last note about full brokers being able to be active without having a BIC is an important one. They can be active and they can be paid, but basically the only thing they can be paid is referral fees. If they want to actively represent a client or actively represent the public, then they have to have a BIC. What's one of the first things up here it says the broker in charge is responsible for? All of the what?
Advertising.
Advertising. So, full broker, full or non-provisional broker who does not have a broker in charge, can they advertise? Who's responsible for advertising? BIC. Full broker that does not have a broker in charge, can they advertise?
No.
No. Because who would be responsible for it? Does that make sense? You know what the #1 form of advertising is? I gave y'all one when you checked in the other night.
Business card.
Business card. You have a business card with your name on it that says real estate broker. You are advertising. So if you're a full broker, you can have your license on active status, and you can technically be paid, but you can't even have a business card unless you're associated with who?
Wow.
A BIC. That hammering home now, how important it is to have a broker in charge, even as a full broker.
So does your firm have a BIC in waiting too?
A BIC in waiting, I love that time.
I know, I was thinking the same thing, I was like, if for
In
some
other words,
reason
do
you
I
were
have somebody
unable.
that takes over in
Right.
the unlikely event that I go to Hawaii for 11 days? Yes, I do. Her name is Leslie, and she's not looking forward to it. She gets it as of Thursday morning, in all its glory. That's what I told her. I sent out an email to all my agents. I said, if you're going to screw up, wait 3 days. Because then Leslie will have to deal with the commission and not me. And I don't mean commission with a little c, with the money attached. I mean commission with a big C, as in Navajo Drive over there, that you don't want to deal with. There's 2 types of commission in this business. One you really want, one you really don't want. the big C, capital C, one you do not want to deal with. And you certainly don't want a brown envelope to come in the mail from them. Because brown envelope means you're being investigated for violating license law. It means they've started an investigation and they believe there's some merit to those charges. And so I always say that the envelope is the color of what you're going to say when you read the contents of the envelope. All right. Any question about this relationship? Okay. The last thing they talk about in this chapter is the difference between an independent contractor and an employee. And again, we've sort of hinted around some of this so far. Brokers, whether they be provisional brokers or full brokers, are going to be independent contractors. An independent contractor is first and foremost somebody who is licensed to perform a task. To be paid on a 1099 for real estate related transactions, you need a real estate license. Okay? And so that's step one. If you're going to be an independent contractor, you need a license. You can't have somebody be paid related to real estate transactions without a real estate license. Okay? The difference between an independent contractor and an employee is independent contractors are paid for tasks. They're paid for success. They don't have set hours. You can't tell an independent contractor you have to be in the office from 9 to 5. That's not what they do. Independent contractors work enough to get the job done. Does that make sense for everybody? They set their own schedule based on what is required of them and their task. That's a commission. An employee is somebody who has a set work schedule, somebody who's paid the same thing whether they sell or don't sell, whether they produce or don't produce. In our business, we have both. We have independent contractors, the brokers, and then employees who are usually the non-licensed people. An unlicensed employee can do a lot of things for either a broker or a property owner that normally a broker would have to do. But you need to know what those things are and what they are not. And we're going to talk about those and those distinctions more as we go through the license law. You know, the kinds of properties they could show, kinds of properties they can't show, for example. They can perform some functions of a real estate broker, but not all.